of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call.
Lorraine Cost.
Here.
Charlie Venuto.
Present.
John Byron.
Yo.
Vinny Toronto.
Here.
Gary Castro. He may not be in today. He wasn't feeling well. David Lane.
Here.
Karen McLaughlin. Here. Stephanie Healy. She may arrive late. John Durkee is asked to be excused. Courtney Barker.
Here.
Todd Swingle.
Here.
Jean Artusa.
Here.
And Danielle Bowden has also asked to be excused on vacation.
And John Windsor.
Did you call him?
I'm sorry, John Windsor.
And John Durkee, is he?
I'm sorry, no, John Durkee has asked to be excused as well.
Okay. Great.
So we're waiting for Stephanie. for that swim.
Okay, great. Okay, everyone's had a chance to look at the agenda. We have a big one today. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
Move we approve the agenda. Second.
And John Windsor seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Approval of the minutes.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. And monthly reports.
Okay. It's been a very busy month going through all of those substitute project applications that came in the Monday after your last meeting. In addition to reviewing those applications and working with the applicants on those applications, we identified ways to encourage more participation and get more nutrients out of the lagoon by enhancing some of those project applications. And so those were the changes that you saw between the early batch of applications that came to you versus the ones last Friday. And we will talk about those changes later on, so I won't go into that now. Lorraine Koss and I met out at the Lagoon and filmed a short video on the first year accomplishments, and we have a short version, and there will be a longer version. The longer version isn't done yet, so we have the short version for you today. The memo that you requested to cities asking them about their response to sewage overflows was signed by your chair and sent out. So we're waiting for cities to respond to that. And we've gotten some calls from them, so they are working on responses. Walker, you want to do the dredging update?
So the MIMS muck dredging and outflow treatment, its status has not changed much since our last meeting. The dredge material management area is under construction. They're probably about 10 to 15% complete of constructing the containment berm. They should probably be done with that in the next 30 to 45 days. And upon completion, they'll commence dredging. Turkey Creek, as noted, the dredging began on January 23rd for the post-Irma cleanup. I believe it was about 14,000, give or take, cubic yards of material that was coming out of Palm Bay proper, and they should be completed dredging next Wednesday.
And the muck dredging master permit, we have our meeting with the Corps.
Yes, we have the meeting scheduled for February 27th. We're going to meet with some folks over in the COCO office. And then it looks like we are targeting March 9th to meet with FDEP staff in the Central District office over in Orlando.
Question. How do we stand on determining that we have sufficient permanent spoil disposal areas for the life of the trust fund?
So we met with Fines, I believe it was before our last COC meeting, and we were coordinating and prioritizing the development of fine sites, and looking at the big picture of the lagoon throughout the county and where our projects are and what year and how they are, where they are geographically in relation to some of these FIND sites. FIND is a very willing and eager partner at this point, based on the meeting we had. So we are going to be probably shuffling around some of our projects to get the low-hanging fruit, if you will, in terms of the dredge projects and the available spoil placement areas.
Take advantage of the fine sites that are already developed DMMAs and are ready to take material now. We would do the projects closest to those first, and the DMMA sites that still need to be developed, FIND is going to take the lead on some of those. They're willing to let us take the lead on others to accelerate making that happen. So we're working on how, and this will be in the amended plan we bring back to you next month, how we resequence the projects to make sense with the available DMMAs. We still have quite a challenge with the Merritt Island project areas and the beaches. There just aren't good DMMAs currently available, and it's very difficult to find large tracts of land. So we will continue with the programmatic permitting team in looking for opportunities to find land to serve those project areas.
But binary question, long-term, all the dredging that we know is going to go on, ours, FIND, municipalities and so on. Is availability of permanent spoil sites going to be a limiting factor on our ability to execute the trust fund or not? What's your guess? Yes, no?
I think long pipelines with multiple booster pumps can overcome any problems. It just comes with a cost. So the idea is, can we find suitable areas that are closer and less expensive?
Sounds like it's being well managed. Thank you.
The $1 million groundwater study, we had a meeting to select the sites for where those groundwater wells are going to be located, and at the same time, we talked about projects that are funded in the plan that we also want to measure the performance of, and we want to measure a subset of those. So we worked through selecting a subset of plan-funded projects to coordinate with the groundwater study, so that when you put all of that data together, it gives you as good a picture as we can of the impacts of septic, the impacts of sewer, the impacts of reclaimed water versus control areas in natural conservation lands. In meetings, I know a number of you were at the Sustainability Summit. There's lots of fascinating possibilities there that I'm sure would benefit the lagoon if we can find ways to implement those locally. We've worked with multiple agencies on establishing a Living Shoreline course for marine contractors and interested participants, and so those course materials are being developed, what that would look like. We're going to talk later today about the education and social marketing campaigns, and the topics that we have selected and written up little summaries for in your agenda are based on a collaborative meeting held by Marine Resources Council about 3 weeks ago. And so we were participants in that collaborative effort. The Indian River Lagoon Symposium at Harbor Ranch was full of lots of great research and a good discussion on citizen science and the potential benefits of that to the lagoon. And yesterday, the County Commission's budget workshop, one of the 3 main topics there was the Save Our Indian River Lagoon Trust Fund and the expenditures of those dollars. And so the main message there was whether more of the Lagoon Trust Fund dollars should go towards addressing the sewage overflow issue. So that will continue to be a a hot topic for elected officials. And then on the back side of the staff report, we're coming into the spring season, Earth Day season. It's just busy as all get out with science forums and public events and volunteer opportunities out there. And so, whether it's landscaping seminars or the Marine Resources Council report card events, we're going to have tabletop displays with Lagoon staff at the Palm Bay Artist Sustainability event and the Pelican Island Wildlife Festival, and several other smaller events, but those are the big ones coming up. And then for your next meeting, I'm sure it will be a very big agenda like this with a lot to cover, but I did want to invite Dwayne DeFries to come talk. He previously had volunteered to work with Walker Dawson on looking at all of the other National Estuary Project plans and what we could learn from those comprehensive conservation and management plans, and whether there's a takeaway that we should be implementing into our plans. And so I think that's a very good discussion to have at the same time that we're considering an update to our lagoon plan. But other than that, I was not planning any speakers.
Well, are there any of those, do you know at this point, are there any of those plans that have particular interest to us? You've been able to identify any particular model that?
I think all of the plans are of interest to us.
Sure.
I think there's potentially good elements of each of those plans that we could glean. Thankfully and luckily, we have someone like Dwayne who's read those plans ad nauseum, and he's offered to help us. So, I think there is a benefit to, without getting into the nuts and bolts of each of the plan, I'm not sure exactly which one would be better, but
Okay.
Luckily we have Dwayne to help.
Out of curiosity, how many plans are there?
That I don't know the answer to.
28?
28?
Yeah, like 28 is.
So there was
28.
22?
I think it's 20.
Yes, a lot.
28 estuaries.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he just had to review all of them several months back for some federal purpose.
And for doing our plan.
Yes. But they went through a process of looking at all the federal NEP plans that were out there and which ones were working well and which ones weren't, and what were the best components of each. And so in preparation of doing the next one, they had a think tank meeting up in D.C., and so we'll get the benefit of all of that thought process.
I may have missed it, but in all of this external relations, I don't see any interface with Brevard Public Schools. And specifically, and this is something, the drum I've been banging elsewhere, including with the superintendent, it seems to me that the STEM slant STEAM programs, which have got a full head of steam, would find a very natural focus on lagoon studies. And this would end up serving the larger purpose of getting kids and families caught up in neat stuff and dealing with wiggly little critters and all the stuff, and the science as well. There's somebody, perhaps a shop, somebody over there who does STEAM slant STEM. And I think it would be a very worthwhile thing to run them in on the really good stuff that's happening here and the opportunities there are in the schools to engage with this. And so I just recommend we look at that. Yes.
I just had, to add on to that, Matt Susan, Board Member Susan, is really
Yes.
involved in
Yes.
a lot of this stuff, and he's been working with our city and our environmental coordinator to do, like greenhouses and having the kids build them and growing and understanding what mangroves do and things like that, and he's very much involved in that. So he's definitely a great resource for, trying to get in, connecting what we do with the schools. And then as far as our city goes, we just partnered with Delora Middle School because I always thought middle school has been kind of, it's like that forgotten realm of, especially when you're a parent, you have a lot of PTO involvement in the elementary, and then it just kind of drops off at middle school. So we're partnering with them to create a junior sustainability board, and that will be appointed by our city council in late March. And they have a little budget, and they do, so they'll have all of that input into even creating their own projects in our city. So those are just some of the things that we can do, and each city could do with their respective schools. But on the larger scale, I think Member Susan's definitely, a person that we probably
It's just
need
an
to get a hold
absolute
of.
natural.
Yeah.
And we have got such resources here with FIT, with Dwayne and his operation, Human Resources Council, marvelous affinity groups and nonprofits, et cetera. And having spent a certain amount of my life in science, I sure wish we had this in Waseca, Minnesota, when I was trying to figure this stuff out.
Can I make a comment there?
Yes.
I don't want to extend the agenda. I want us to keep moving forward. I have to be out of here on time today for a reason. I've had a lot of experience with trying to get curricula involved in Brevard County schools. Administrators at high levels always do a great job of talking about things. It always falls back on the teacher to implement, and the best kinds of projects are those ones where the local school has gotten a partnership with somebody in their community and gotten something going there. Instituting a Lagoon-wide curriculum for the Brevard County school system has been tried before, and it's not been terribly effective. And so I would suggest, if you're going to do something like this, if you're going to go back to Virginia and say, you guys should go do this with the school board, which is what I'm hearing you say, I would suggest we spend some time here at a budgeted time at a future meeting and invite some of the education people here and let them talk about this, not us.
That would be, I'd like to see that on the
We're
agenda.
dealing with a bureaucracy that would challenge Kafka.
You got a comment over there?
Yes.
As a former educator, one of the vehicles that you have, one of the best vehicles that you have, is to present something during in-service. And one of the best attended in-services that we have is the one at the zoo. And so the zoo is already partnering with us. It would be a natural vehicle because educators are constantly looking for something fun to do on in-service day rather than just something that they have to sit through. And so that would be a natural vehicle to talk to them about bringing in whatever group we target that could implement curriculum for Indian River Lagoon restoration.
Okay, great. So maybe we can think about that for a future agenda. I did speak with the superintendent briefly, and he talked about the marine curriculum that they're developing, and of course he seems very open to that.
And we have worked with Matt Susan, and we've jointly written grants together. None of those have been funded so far, but we continue to come up with those ideas. We also, Brandon Smith participates in the Space Coast Science Educators, and so, working with those specific science teachers to come up with project ideas that the student will engage the students. So we're working it at other levels, but
In Virginia was very helpful with us in getting
I told
our
this thing to
stuff
be
off the ground.
quiet, but I don't know. Stop.
You just pull it down from you do that?
No, it's, we got issued new phones, and I can't figure out how to...
What was your point? Courtney, I missed what you were saying.
Oh, I was just saying that when Virginia was working with Matt on those grants, that was kind of like the foundation of what we're doing with our city, so
Okay.
it helped a lot.
I wonder if this wouldn't be a useful, we got 125K sitting there this year. I wonder if it might not be a useful expenditure, or 5, 10, or 15, 20K, to figure out a program specifically focused on BPS and STEM, and bring in some expertise, and once you do that, you engage the bureaucracy, you engage, all these good ideas now have a programmatic home, and if it's done cooperatively with the right people in BPS, we might get somewhere. I'd certainly welcome
I
it.
think that agenda item would be the best way to do, to start all that. Get that. on the
Later.
agenda, Yeah.
Yeah,
Later,
get that on
Maybe
the
it's just a
agenda
case
later.
of coming up with plug-and-play models, proof sources, pilot programs, and just extend them everywhere.
Okay, so we'll move on to the
I did,
budget.
Lorraine, I had
Oh, go
three
ahead.
things real quick. One, with the muck dredging master permit, I just wanted to reiterate that I hope that we can find a way to communicate or advertise it like we talked about, since this is a permit that's going to be bigger than your normal permit. If we could find a way to make sure that we're going above and beyond the public advertising on that. That was one thing. The second thing, the multiple agencies and partners meeting to do the Living Shoreline course. I'm hoping there's some way to capture the result, the outcomes, to see how many of those marine contractors are actually doing those, to see what the need is, the market desire. And then also, I know there is a Living Shoreline map being created, and I didn't know if that Living Shoreline map is going to take private property into consideration as opposed to just public lands. The third thing, and it may be a hot topic, but to go along with your hot topic about the politics of the money being spent, is there an appetite, or should this committee send some sort of communique saying how they feel the situation with the money should be spent on sewage overflows versus the Lagoon plan? And that's something I'll just throw out. We don't have to discuss it now if we don't want to. I know John's in a hurry or has things to do. Sorry, didn't mean to reference
I'm in a hurry.
that. But I just didn't know if we went and said now, this is our opinion, as opposed to waiting for a decision to be decided and then us saying, well, that's not the decision we would have made.
Well, we are going to be getting some data back from the municipalities in terms of overflows. We sent a letter last week, so we do have more information coming in. It might be better once we've been able to assess that.
I
And
agree.
the
Yeah.
pilot project going on at Satellite Beach, the consultant is working on the smoke testing should begin in March or April. It'll be going on through May. And so once we have that data back, that will give us a better idea of what the impacts of those leaky pipes are. And so that was the response to the county commission yesterday, is
Okay.
we need to collect this data so that we know what we're dealing with, and then we can come up with an appropriate response.
And I'm a huge data-driven person. I think my concern is just the timeline and making sure that we can get our opinion, or if we're going to have an opinion, get it out early so that we're kind of leading the discussion as opposed to catching the discussion midway.
But
Good point.
we've got a very good plan to spend about $350 million. We're going to have more than $350 million. Right now, we don't have a whole lot of stuff to sop that up. Given the strength of public interest in sewage and problems there, I wonder if it might not be a really good thing to get behind some push of at least the excess dollars in that direction. If it doesn't affect our core program, I think it's in the direction of credibility to the overall effort to clean it up. May not have
Okay.
anything to do with nitrogen removal at all, but it may have an awful lot to do with the overall effectiveness of the trust fund program.
And it won't take much of those projects to sop it up, because those are very expensive projects, so.
And we also need to look at, we have a lot more muck dredging needed
Yeah.
than what's programmed. So those are there is, even for that extra money, there's competing funds there,
Yeah.
competing uses, so.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that a little bit more in some of the reports, so go ahead and
So if I may, that's a great
let's go forward.
segue to this part of the fiscal report. So if you extend these lines out to the end of this fiscal year, to September 30th, the delta between what we projected and what the state projected is about $22 million. In your packet today are requests for different projects. We've previously called them substitute projects, but you could call them additional projects, you could call them whatever you want, that total over $21 million. So there are many ways to put these dollars to work, and it's in your agenda for today. I'm done.
Oh, okay.
So Virginia, real quick, so you're saying that there's projected 22 million additional,
Yes.
and the new projects equals around 21 million?
Yes.
And what about the 15 million reserve? Is that included in the new projects?
No.
Okay. And I know we'll get to that later.
Okay. So we can move on to our special presentation on the algae bloom status. So Dr. Jacoby.
Yep. Thank you for the opportunity, and promised I would keep this quick. So here's the take-home message in case you do have to go somewhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about current conditions, and I'm going to compare it to 2016 because that's probably the most similar kind of bloom that we've seen so far. And I want to take you back, put that a little bit in context. So go back over our period of record, as it were, which is really only about a solid 20 years, which isn't all that long, but that's what we have. And talk a little bit about what we've seen happen with the kind of number of blooms, the intensity of the blooms, and the fact that the species, the types of single-celled algae that are in the blooms have changed. And then talk a little bit about some of the things that we found as we were doing the algal blooms investigation, which tells us potentially why some of the factors that might drive that change and what it might mean to how you go forward. So it's a satellite image. This is the new European satellite, Sentinel. And it's probably hard to see here, but the world's looking a little green, particularly in Banana River Lagoon. And this is the sort of central IRL. But you can see what water would probably look like in the northern IRL if it wasn't having a bloom. So what we do is we use the bands, the color bands of that image, and we can model and estimate chlorophyll values. And so the hotter colors are higher chlorophyll values, chlorophyll being that thing we use to measure phytoplankton biomass, the amount of phytoplankton that are in the water. And so you can see that Banana River Lagoon is pretty warm. There's a quite high cell counts are probably expected in there. And that continues down south in the central IRL. So let's look back. This is a Landsat image where you can do the same kind of thing. Sentinel just has a few more bands. It's a little bit better imager. It's new, so it wasn't around at that time in 2016. But you can see that in Banana River Lagoon, 2016 was the big brown tide that led to the fish kill, and that's a little hotter. So in essence, we're not quite there yet. We're not as warm as we were in 2016, and you can hope that that doesn't happen again. But it's definitely brown tide out there is the predominant plankton that we see. So let's take a quick look at how that fits in history. So what I've tried to do here is to put on the y-axis here the percentage of samples with blooms. So the number of times that people went out and found phytoplankton at a concentration that would be classified as a bloom. And you can see on the bottom, because percentages are a little bit tricky, you can see the number of times that they went and looked. And you can see that that's ramped up in the recent years. That's part of the algal blooms investigation. We did a little more intensive sampling. This is focused in on what I've called unique blooms. So sometimes you'll get a couple of dominant species, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is just like one bloom, even if it's a mix of species. And I think the take-home message is that, from 2002 up till around 2011, it was in the 20-30% or less mark. 2011 was what we called the super bloom. We might have to revise that given 2016, but I haven't actually done that yet. But after sort of 2011, you're up around 40% of the times they go out. So the frequency, as it were, of the blooms has increased recently. And then if we look at who the players are, in the good old days, as it were, it was mostly diatoms and dinoflagellates, so the yellow bars and the red bars. Also a few of what we call cyanobacteria, which are actually bacteria that do photosynthesis, but they were a different kind of cyanobacteria from what we've seen lately. Around, again, 2011, we picked up what are called picocyanobacteria, so really small cyanobacteria, as well as what we're calling now a nanoeukaryote. So that's, again, a very small cell, a green cell. We think we've identified it now. No one really knew what it was. It hadn't been dominant before. It was in samples from the past. It just had never been a dominant. And then you can see here in 2012 was the first brown tide. And then we had the big brown tide in 2016. Now this is the same species that bloomed in Laguna Madre, Texas, and it bloomed there for about 10 years in a row, just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. It's eventually stopped, but it was problematic for about 10 years. So the players have changed. One of probably the key things about the change in players, and on the right-hand side here are the different kinds of things that we've seen bloom in the past. And as you go to the newer players down near the bottom, they're smaller. So if you take the brown tide, for example, if you look at your agenda and find a period, you could put 200 of these things side by side across that period. So they're really tiny. And the picocyanobacteria are actually even smaller, like an order of magnitude 10 times smaller in general. So they're very small, which means that they turn over very quickly. So they divide very quickly. And that tends to mean that you get more intense blooms because they're churning faster. But they also have some other challenging behaviors. And this comes out of our investigation that the district funded. These are some data from there. On the top is a graph that shows what's called the relative preference index. So if the index is over 1, which is that middle line there, so those are the bars going up, that means they prefer that type of nitrogen compound. So ammonium is preferred by almost all phytoplankton because energetically it's the simplest to use. They can get right at the nitrogen they want. Nitrate takes a little bit more energy. They have to break off the oxygen, and that involves a special enzyme and an input of energy. And so you can see here that this is that nanoeukaryote, the thing I'm calling chlorified, and the picocyanobacteria, they prefer ammonium, which you'd expect, and they don't necessarily make good use of nitrate, which is something that we have a reasonable amount of in and around the lagoon. But the kind of different thing is that they can use what we call organic nitrogen, which in this case were amino acids. So that's nitrogen that's bound to carbon. That's the way that it comes off of things like, if you have rotting plants or other kinds of things. It's usually organic nitrogen that comes first. Typically what happens then is that the bacteria in the water column they take that nitrogen off the carbon, incorporate it in themselves, and then it gets into the rest of the system. Right? So these particular phytoplankton can skip that microbial loop, as it's called. So they get at the nitrogen and phosphorus, it looks like, quicker than some of the other phytoplankton, which means that they compete pretty well because they can get at nitrogen and phosphorus that isn't available to the things like the diatoms and the dinoflagellates that we used to see bloom in the past. That means that they also means that they cycle faster, so it helps them turn over faster, which means that there's less loss. So every time there's a kind of a conversion, some of that nitrogen or phosphorus gets kind of lost to the system. It's not so available, which means, again, that helps these guys compete. So that's potentially one of the reasons we're seeing them win at the moment. The other thing that it looks like they might do is what's called fix nitrogen. So they actually pull it out of thin air. So there are nitrogen fixers, legumes, and things like that. They have the bacteria that help them pull actual atmospheric nitrogen in and use it. That's not something that most phytoplankton can do. Now, this is a graph of a measurement of fixation, how much nitrogen was fixed in a flask, as it were. And you can see it's very patchy. So in August, they got tremendous amount of fixation. Before that, they saw very little, and after that, they saw some. But the point is that the data overall show that the number of picocyanobacteria, those little blue-greens that are in that whatever water they're testing, that there's a positive correlation of fixation with that, right? So if there's a lot of those there, they got more fixation. Same temperature, as temperature goes up, the things operate faster, they fix more. There's negative correlations with the concentrations of nitrogen. So if there's a lot of nitrogen available, then you don't get much fixation, and that makes sense, because why would you bother? Why would you throw energy at pulling nitrogen out of the atmosphere when it's available in the water column? And there's also a negative correlation with what we call the N to P ratio. So if the amount of nitrogen relative to the amount of phosphorus that's available is high, again, they don't bother because phosphorus is going to be limiting. There's not enough phosphorus for them to use the nitrogen even if they fix it. So what we interpret here is that if nitrogen concentrations go down or phosphorus concentrations go up, then we may see a change in the fixation rate. And we've kind of seen that kind of change across most of the lagoon in the last years. So here we have one form of nitrogen, what's called total Keldon nitrogen in the dissolved state. So it's just the amount of nitrogen in the water column from sort of 96 to 2017. And these maybe just focus on the lines. So the lines are the mean for 96 to 2009 and 2010 to 2017. So nitrogen concentrations don't appear to have changed, and this is in Mosquito Lagoon is in the blue, Banana River Lagoon is in the green, and the Northern IRL is in the red. But if you look at one form of phosphorus, the total phosphorus in the dissolved state, you'd see that around 2010, we saw a step up in the amount of phosphorus. And we're still looking at trying to figure out exactly how that got there. But the point is that that ratio changed, and it may have favored these things that can fix nitrogen. So, what are the take-home messages? Chlorophyll's still the issue, all right? So, we're going to manage chlorophyll, and that's good. And we got a long way to go before we have to worry about anything else. But the sources of chlorophyll in the lagoon have been changing. And that's a concern. The new sources appear to be particularly bad actors. They use different types of nitrogen and phosphorus. Again, they can use the organic nitrogen and phosphorus, and they can fix nitrogen. And it looks as if the ratios or types of nitrogen that are available, so if there's a lot of organic available, that's going to favor these phytoplankton. Versus if it's inorganic, which other things can get at. And likewise, that whole question about the ratio of nitrogen and phosphorus. So, for me, and I guess what I'd like to communicate is that there may be value in thinking about things a level or two below the level at which you manage. So you're going to manage chlorophyll concentrations for the foreseeable future, but 7, 10, however many years from now, you may want to be able to do some things with ratios. You may want to be able to do some things with, types of nitrogen and types of phosphorus. And so that's where this information can be helpful. Yes?
Two things that I noticed. One is that even though the cyanobacteria are overtaking, the levels of the other players seems to remain pretty constant over time. If you go back and look at the graph, they're pretty constant. So they're still there. It's just that, look at the red line. It's pretty constant.
The red line are dinoflagellates. That's particularly your pyridinium, which is the bioluminescence that everybody so loves. And yeah, they're still around, and they still bloom. It's not like they're going away.
Right. But these are overtaking them.
Right.
And the fact that they can fix nitrogen, that's scary. But the other part of that is that it seems that we need to be looking not just at nitrogen levels, but also at phosphorus levels. Because if there isn't enough phosphorus, they're not going to fix nitrogen. And so they're only going to be depending upon the nitrogen that's already there in the system.
Right. So, in the long term, as you get potentially closer to the goal, you may want to think more about the ratios of nitrogen and phosphorus. And so, overall, I would say yes, try to reduce both. So there's a kind of a debate in the scientific literature that went on for a long time about, nitrogen was the concern, phosphorus in lakes was the concern. And then eventually I think people came around to realize that, you got to treat them both together, because that's how organisms use them. They can't use one without the other, as it were. So you have to think about both.
Right now, our approach is pretty much brute force. Get the bad stuff out, keep the bad stuff out. If we do find ourselves having to adjust that strategy downstream, as your suggestion we may, are there existing programmatic approaches to a strategy to deal one level, as you say, one level below? Do we have to figure something out? Do we need new science and technology, or is there something we can use our primary tool, throwing money at the problem? Is there some place to receive it?
I think there will be. I mean, I think this is something that we have to pull together, and then potentially come back to you and say, here's where we think you might want to invest at some point. Here's how we would go about doing some of this. There are people who are thinking about it. I'm not sure that anybody's actually incorporated into a management scheme yet, but it would potentially involve things, like looking at the ratio of organic nitrogen and phosphorus coming out of septic, say, versus coming out of stormwater and things like that. So yeah, I think in the future, as you get closer, and if things are not behaving the way you want them to, then some of these issues, you may go, okay, let's get a better understanding of how to do this.
What do you think of what we're doing now?
I think it's great. I mean, I think right now, so people have told me in the past, I've gone to lots of meetings and say, we need a roadmap, and I go, well, yeah, eventually we will need a pretty detailed roadmap possibly. But right now, the goal is a warm, fuzzy glow over the horizon. Just go that way, and that's what people are doing, and I think it's great. None of the things that people are doing at the moment will they ever regret. I can pretty much promise you that. Now, it may not solve the problem. We may have to go a little deeper, but nothing will be regretted in the future.
Sure.
Dr. Jacoby, real quick, 2 questions. I noticed when there was a bad bloom, the year after it kind of dropped down quite a bit historically. I think in one of the other slides it showed that too. Do you think that, and I'm just looking at trend-wise, is that something that you've seen as a trend? Like one year when it's so bad that it eats up so much of the excess nitrogen phosphorus, the next year it's not as bad, but because the problem is never addressed, it continuously ramps up. And I didn't know if that was a trend that you...
I think the ups and downs, as it were, have a lot to do with the conditions. So, again, a lot of this is driven by rainfall and other temperature and other things like that. But sure, I think, sometimes the available nitrogen and phosphorus gets bound up, and it takes a little while to get back into the flow.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, so if the nitrogen and phosphorus is related, if you were to take one, like nitrogen, way down and not touch the phosphorus, that would also limit the amount of brown tide? No.
If these organisms can fix nitrogen, then that strategy tends to fail. And what you do is you shift the players. Right. So you shift it, and you unbalance the system towards a certain competitor. Right. So diatoms and dinoflagellates would drop off because they kind of need both, and they can't get it themselves, but other things would. So.
Thank you.
And that's in freshwater lakes. That's where the microcystis comes in, because it can fix nitrogen. And so if you unbalance the system, you tend to get far more microcystis versus other things.
Is pH a factor?
Potentially at some stage, but at this stage, the pH in the lagoon doesn't go far enough off, as it were, to be a problem. So.
Our future of determining our success is highly dependent on measurements. What's the future of monitoring at the district? Are we doing enough monitoring? Is there long-term plans to continue the monitoring?
Some things will continue and some things won't continue. So much like everybody, there are fiscal constraints, and some of the recent events are tightening those fiscal constraints. So, but we continue, certainly. Part of my job is to go to other players. I think generally speaking, particularly for monitoring, I think it's going to have to go back a little bit towards what it was in the old days, which was
You happen to have the number of samples there, so you see how that increased during the bloom years, and I think the district...
So that was a district, this algal blooms investigation was about $6 million plus district dollars over a period of, it'll turn out to be about 6 years. But the monitoring will probably need to be a group effort more. And it used to be a little bit more in the old days. Different people would do different parts of it. For the district, I think it was because they had the resources and because it's often simpler to just do it yourself. I mean, you have a little more control over what happens. It just slowly kind of got pulled into the district, and now I think we have to go back, and groups like this and, other groups at the estuary program, we need to sit and talk about what do we need to know, what can we afford to know, and how are we going to make that happen. So, I think that there will be a change, I think, in how things go. And I'm hoping that, we can pick up on what we need.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, the collateral benefits, so this was an interesting memo.
Right, so I think that presentation leads well to this item, which Dr. Windsor brought to us. Part of the reason that the plan is written sort of in the currency of nitrogen is that during the process of removing nitrogen, you capture lots of other pollutant types. That is not true for phosphorus. There are all sorts of ways that you can go specifically after phosphorus alone and virtually have no other benefits. So, do you want to add anything? Sorry, I probably just
I think one of the things we're talking about is how the plan is going to incorporate some of this language so that the public knows that we're not just hyper-focused on nitrogen. That, in our view, in our mind, we're already getting all this stuff. We already know about the collateral benefits, so we're going to help communicate this issue to the public by expanding the language in the plan.
Will this be a text change in our recommendation to the county commission?
It would be incorporated into the plan that you would recommend in March to go to the county. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can you,
Go ahead. Well, I did have one question. I was looking at the second page, the second paragraph, where it talks about advanced wastewater treatment technologies, and that they remove or neutralize harmful contaminants, but they're talking about pharmaceuticals. Now, it's been about a decade since I've been deeply into this, but at that point, it was membrane treatment that really did that. Now, as far as I know, we don't really have any of that going on in Brevard, do we?
No, part of that, so talking to some of the UF specialists, you can get almost too detailed in that. What one of millions of pharmaceuticals are we actually going to target? Mm-hmm. Well, then at that point, we can't really answer that question. But what it is that, how it was explained to me, the increased settling out and targeting of other things does capture some collateral compounds,
right?
But not everything is captured.
Yes, so there's still education to be done in terms of pharmaceuticals, because my understanding is that most of the wastewater treatment technologies we're using now will not necessarily capture those, so we really need to work on prevention with the public, putting those in our water supply to begin with, and
yeah, and that is happening. I was just in a meeting this week with a new UF professor who is going to work on that. So we have those opportunities to see what kind of issue it is in Florida, because hasn't been much, no one's really looked at it just specifically in Florida.
And, the medical industry is inventing new drugs daily.
Right.
And so the wastewater technology is always behind the curve in trying to address they don't have the resources and aren't as nimble as those drug companies. So that's always a challenge. The technology is going to address some pharmaceuticals, but not all of them. I don't know if you have anything to add, but
yeah, from a practical standpoint, until you start going to membranes, it's you're not going to remove some portions of it. Conventional technologies depends. It depends on the nature of what goes in there, may or may not. But there still is a big question of what the impact of those are. There's a lot of debate over, when you get these at detectable versus if you can detect it, is it a problem, or at what level does it become a problem? And I agree that the nature of education is important, but don't forget, probably the biggest contributor of the concentration is not people putting it there by dumping waste. It's that they process it through their body and dump it
Exactly,
inherently
yeah.
regardless, so that's not going to change.
And then we have a demographic that probably uses more medication.
But certainly, when you have those leftover pills, you don't want to flush them.
Exactly.
You
Sure.
want to dissolve them and wrap them up and put them in the garbage so they go to the lined solid waste facility.
For everyone to know, the EPA recommends wrapping up in coffee grounds and throwing it in your trash.
Very good.
Right, I had-
Thank you. Yes.
Along with those, Anthony, is there any way that we can, again, I'm a big data person, is there any way that we can track or monitor any of the change of those additional pollutants without blowing our monitored budget through the roof?
It would be very hard. Some of the things, like fecal coliform is very, big in the news, and that's it's kind of everywhere, and we are measuring it everywhere. So
And the big challenge with that is the way that the collection happens. You have 6 hours from when you collect it to getting it to the lab that can do the analysis. And so you can't do a full field day campaign of data collection and still drive to New Smyrna with your lab sample. So it really changes the cost of your whole sampling protocol.
Is there a way we could at least do a baseline for some of these? At least do one, I mean, just because we're going to be putting this in the plan, and I think it's great, I think it's important that people see that there is additional benefits that we're treating. I just think that there has to be a way to say how much of a change and difference there is.
We have a contract with Florida Tech that, well, I think the ink's not dry yet, but for Dr. Drew Palmer to collect samples in the Sykes Creek dredging area and show which of these components are in the muck. And so yes, in answer to your question, yes, there's a way that we can capture some of this data in some locations and share that, and we can think harder about whether we want a more pointed approach.
Todd?
Okay, thank you.
So I agree with this in concept, but one of the concerns is, and we just heard that with all of the basics of just the big players, the nitrogen and phosphorus, that our target is still over the horizon. And so I do think we got to be a little careful of getting, too shotgunned on and losing focus on that we're not even close to the things that we know are the big players. And so we can get derailed by thinking about pharmaceuticals and all these little things that may or may not have anything really of substance to do with it. But we're still putting in septic tanks. We're still loading up yards with fertilizer. We're still doing marginal stormwater treatment. We still are loading up muck. Even when we're demucking, we're putting muck back in the basin that is going to recontribute nitrogen, except for, I'm proud of Cocoa Beach. That's one of the things they're looking to do is not have the muck go on traditional spoil sites. So we got to be careful not to get off point, because we know we've got heavy hitters that we are nowhere close to addressing yet.
John?
And the biggest criticism I keep hearing in the public is, you people are only focusing on nitrogen. And my point was, that when we're treating for nitrogen, we're not changing our plan to treat for these other things. Those things are going away with it, at least in part. And so we need to make sure people understand we're not just treating just for nitrogen. We're treating to improve the health of the lagoon. Nitrogen's a big removal component. Phosphorus is, sediments are. These things are important to get out to the public, because we've been criticized in public, even at this meeting. We were chastised for, you guys better be careful about focusing so much on nitrogen. Okay? And every time somebody makes that comment, I try to challenge them outside this meeting that we're doing things besides removing nitrogen.
Todd?
And I agree with that, but it's still, we have to be careful about our job is to be science-based. We do need to make sure we engage the public, but part of that is educating the public on what the priorities are going to be, and if nitrogen really needs to be the priority, then that has to be a focus on how to make that education piece, because some of the numbers that are in here, when you start talking about the sewage spills and the releases from laterals, we're talking about hundreds of pounds, but it becomes a very emotional issue because there is no one that thinks that putting raw sewage into a water body makes sense. It doesn't. It's not good. But it's an emotional issue that may or may not have significant impact on the long-term health of the lagoon as some of the other day-to-day sources that are occurring. And so that's one of the challenges I think we have, is making sure that the science is out there to understand where the priorities have, and balancing out the emotional side of some of these responses.
Thank you.
I find myself in violent agreement with both these esteemed gentlemen. I'd say it more crudely. Let's do what we're doing. Let's tell people what we're doing. Let's tell them why it matters. But let's avoid turning this into a hobby shop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and so I think we're ready to move on to new business. I'm wondering do we want to do the video outreach? That'll just take a minute, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because I want to make sure we get John's.
You're the
Have
star,
John here
right?
first. I was really hoping this would push this on until the next week. I haven't seen this, by the way. This is.
Yeah, so one of the first projects completed with the project was the denitrification barrier at Long Point Park around their package treatment plant, and we put in some monitoring wells there. And actually, the first couple weeks that I was on the job, I was involved with that, and so this is the video from that. I'm Brandon Smith with Brevard County Natural Resources, and we're down here at Long Point Park today putting in some monitoring wells. So what we have down here is what's known as a package plant that is used to treat the wastewater that comes from the restrooms of the campgrounds. After it moves through the primary treatment in the plant, the water is discharged into this containment pond, where it seeps into the ground and eventually out into the Indian River Lagoon. Now, while the package plant does the primary treatment, it is unable to remove all of the nitrogen from the water. So we've installed a denitrification barrier between the pond and the lagoon to further remove the nitrogen and help the water quality in our lagoon area. Now, when we put this barrier in, there was an area where we had some utility lines that we could not put the barrier. But this allowed us the perfect opportunity to test the effectiveness of the barrier. So what we are doing with these monitoring wells is we have wells on the side of the treatment pond, and then we have other wells set up on the opposite side, one on the barrier and one on the opposite side of the break of the barrier. And that'll allow us to compare how effective the barrier is at removing nitrogen from that treatment pond and showing how it'll help improve the lagoon. And then the other video we have to show is that short version of the year-end summary.
Hi, I'm Virginia Barker, Director of the Brevard County Natural Resources Management Department. I'm here today to talk to you about the Save Our Indian River Lagoon program, funded by the half-penny sales tax that was approved by the voters in November of 2016. Collections began in January of 2017, and revenues so far are ahead of schedule. Our 2017 accomplishments include establishing good governance, funding 63 projects this fiscal year, engaging the community in solutions, and creating responsive and transparent management.
It's my honor to be chair of the Citizen Oversight Committee. We were created to represent you, and we hope that you'll participate, that you'll follow us, that you'll even come to the meetings. It's an education process. Now, we were created to spend the money wisely, to make sure we get the biggest bang for the buck. As you heard from Virginia, the projects are really starting to flow, but we're not over the bridge yet. It took us a long time to get to the point of collapse in the lagoon. The legacy pollution that's there, that's going to have to be removed. We're going to have to reduce those excess nutrients. So we need your patience, but we also need you to be a part of the solution. We need to reduce our fertilizer use.
create lagoon-friendly landscapes, help rebuild those living shorelines, and support legislation that takes septic to sewer. Now, I'm confident that we've got a 10-year, science-based, data-driven, and adaptive-friendly plan that is going to get us there. It's going to get us to that tipping point. But again, we need some patience these first couple of years as we get there, and then we need you to be a part of the solution, to be part of the Indian River Lagoon community. Together, we can save our Indian River Lagoon.
Up for an Oscar?
Getting their SAG cards soon.
Okay, moving on.
Moving right along, right.
The update.
Right, so we had a couple more withdrawals. So the table in your packet provides a full list of all those withdrawals. Like last time, these are projects that just, once you got out into the field and started looking at the specifics, they weren't going to play out. In the county's case, we were counting on a large grant that did not come through, and so the project wasn't financially viable anymore. So I just wanted you to...
And these are all the stormwater projects?
Yes.
Do you need a motion?
No.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question real quick? On the third one down, the International Drive baffle box, I just was wondering why the lagoon tax eligibility was more than the lagoon tax funding amount approved. All the others were equal.
The amount they requested, if you look at the total cost column, it's...
I got you. Okay,
right.
so because
the
of their
total cost was less than what they were eligible to receive.
moving. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. And this case, so we're moving on to, Anthony again.
Expansion of outreach. So just as an introduction, during multiple meetings, the committee has encouraged us to look at expanding outreach, to take on more topics, to cover the full 10 years. And so we endeavored to do that. It's some very quick analysis. What we didn't want to do was replicate the work being done by other groups. And so we waited until the MRC event 3 weeks ago that also brought in the National Estuary Program. We also coordinated with the work that Martha Monroe has been doing, that she came and presented to you earlier. And so we used the highlights from that meeting to be the basis of the topics that were analyzed in these memos.
Yeah, and I got some pretty pictures to help communicate that. So at this meeting, we tried to look for the low-hanging fruit and what were basically the activities that humans do that harm the lagoon. And together we all went and put some orange dots next to them. Then we looked at which ones are the hardest human activities to change, and we put some blue dots next to them. Kind of graphed those just to see visually what were the easy things. And I was just showing you some of our work. And basically in this brainstorming event, we found some activities that we in the Sorrel team would be able to expand outreach with. And a lot of them correspond to our initial lawn fertilizer outreach campaign. They're part of that. So as an example, one of the things was in our current outreach explained in the Lagoon plan, how we need to help educate the community on what the ordinance is saying. So at a local box store just down the road from here, you can get both 50% slow release nitrogen lawn fertilizer or 35% slow release. Well, the 50% slow release is what is allowed in the ordinance. Technically, the 35% isn't following through with that, compliant. So we are, part of that outreach would help educate local homeowners on the difference and how to read the difference. Some of the expansion we've already talked about in here, the grass clippings campaign. These are, a lot of these are all related. Another one that we came up with is excess irrigation. A lot of people, based on some social surveys, aren't fully aware of the proper irrigation methods in our sandy soil and growing, different types of grasses and stuff. And you can easily leach out what nutrients you apply by overwatering. So this is definitely low-hanging fruit. According to our UF partners, they agree and recommend this kind of outreach. The picture here is, you can't see very well, is a blue dye test. It's a way of showing homeowners, golf courses, other things, if you water with blue dye, you can see how quickly that water reaches down. And if that goes below the root zone, you can visually experience the nitrogen being washed away. Another part of the outreach would be septic maintenance outreach. Duval County has started this, and so I've started talking to them to see what kind of outreach they're doing and if it's getting a good response. It's just started, so those conversations are ongoing. But the EPA has some materials, the Florida Department of Health has some materials, and then we can also develop some materials ourselves here. And then stormwater pond outreach. This is actually something desired by the community. That's what we've been finding. The IFAS is starting some programs, University of Florida, and then and we definitely see a great partnership here to be able to teach HOAs and other parts of the community some proper stormwater pond maintenance and best management practices. And a lot of these different outreach projects are going to be initiated through our request for qualifications. We're still looking for partners to help develop focus groups and marketing materials. And once we have that request through, that proposals, we'll be able to hit the ground running with these.
You have questions? Yes, John.
Is the RFQ out for the education proposals?
The bid package has been fully reviewed, but the county recently changed its policy that the contract that you're going to use with whoever the winning contractors are must be a part of that package. And so that contract we've written and it's in legal review. No?
No, it's back in your office.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So we should be going to procurement very soon. Yeah.
Two things. Can we expect to get from you for the next year's budget new numbers on that line item that says education? If in your judgment and study, 125K isn't enough, and can we expect to see that extended for years beyond the 5-year window? Are you going to come to us and say, we think this year we ought to go after the right amount of money for the right number of years for the right, it sounds like you're getting to the right program.
Yeah.
So, thank you. The very first line in your substitute
Yes.
project table is expanded outreach. And so this $1.1 million, that's the first row here, is the sum of additional dollars recommended in 4 out of the 5 memos. So the first memo is taking the 125 that was already in the plan for fertilizer and spreading that out over 10 years instead of 5 years. The other 4 memos are new programs that would add 1.1 million.
Okay. Second thing, I wonder if the committee might want to extend an invitation to corporate representatives of Lowe's, Ace Hardware, and Home Depot to come here and tell us what they're doing to save the Indian River Lagoon. They're the node that all this fertilizer flows through. Let's get them to either stand and deliver or tell us that they don't care.
Yes, Todd.
Very related to that is that I think the education's great. I'm a big proponent of it, support it, but we've got to tie that into very clearly actionable items as well. And I think at the sustainability conference that Courtney sponsored, one of the big things, the comments came about as far as market forces versus education. I don't completely agree with that because I think education is a key part of driving people to create that market force. But to John's comment, if we can do that so that we can start creating clearly actionable items that whether some people don't really want to learn about the stuff as much as just tell me what I can do, and to make it simple. And so the more that we can tie it into actionable, simple items that don't have to necessarily learn about it, but just can do it and know they're doing the right thing, I think that's a big connection we've got to achieve. On the irrigation side, if you want to touch base with me, I've got tons of research that we've done with UF,
For sure.
and that beyond just on alternative controller strategies and weather sensors, and some reductions that we've seen as much as anywhere from 40 to 70% water reduction on using alternative controller strategies with Dr. Dukes up at UF.
Okay, yeah.
What kind of, have we had any conversations, or have other groups had conversations with the big box companies, the Home Depots and the Lowe's?
Indian Harbor was successful in getting Lowe's to put a sign at the fertilizer area that said, right now there's a ban on, so they were able to get that particular store to do that.
So I'm asking if we even reached out to them before we put them on the spot and asked them here.
Can we legally ask them? Can
Yes.
we legally extend
Yes.
an invitation? I move that we extend an invitation to major suppliers, major retail outlets for fertilizer, and invite them to come before this committee at a time appropriate to describe what they're doing to save the Indian River Lagoon. I'll look for a second.
Todd, are you seconding it?
Can't
I'll
second.
second.
Okay, Courtney, I'll second. And discussion?
I'll second it.
Okay, Jean seconded it. Now, is there any discussion?
Just to comment on who to invite, it to the extent, without going too far beyond, to the extent that we could identify their corporate sustainability groups, because this is exactly in line with a lot of the corporate sustainability efforts. I think we may have better luck at getting traction than when just with some of the, certainly the local store managers, we might get signs, things like that, but to the extent we can engage that corporate sustainability level, if we can get buy-in at that, then we could really move the needle.
So are we
My
looking at
motion
inviting
incorporates
regional representatives, or we're looking at inviting representatives from each of the stores?
I agree with John. Leave that up to, that was more just an additive comment.
Yeah, I think
don't
my
think it
motion
affects
incorporates discretion by the staff.
Okay, great. Okay, let's call the question then. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. Okay, so we're moving on to the substitute project request. No, wait, we just finished that.
Interstitial water. Where's the,
We're on C2.
This is really good stuff.
you have a handout. You should have a handout at your station. Prepared to publish it?
So we have had some requests, two of which, one came from the city of Cocoa Beach and the other from the city of Indian Harbor Beach, for additional cost-sharing funds associated with their dredging projects and the interstitial water testing, which is the one component of the MIMS project that the Sorrel has cost-shared in. So I think one thing that's worth pointing out is in our cost share requests for Grand Canal, Mims, and Sykes Creek, a portion of that cost was tied, a portion of the cost share cost was tied to the interstitial water testing. However, water treatment. But it was not broken out in the initial cost share request or the funding request under the plan update. So we had to go back to the drawing board and really break this out so the local partners who are doing dredging projects have the option to do interstitial water treatment and obtain cost share funding for that. So what you have here is just a real simple graphic that shows the nutrients in the sediment versus the fraction of nutrients in the interstitial water, if you will, in the dredged material, and then the residual nutrients that's in the water that's going to be discharged back to the lagoon.
So most of the nutrients are in the solids, and so when we dredge and we remove the solids, we get the blue part of the pie chart. But there are dissolved nutrients that are in the water that's in the mix with the solids, so that the liquid part of the muck. And so rather than return that to the lagoon, there are technologies that can help strip those nutrients out. We tested some of those technologies in our first Turkey Creek project. When we went to bid on the MIMS project, we included several levels of treatment options in our bid document to see what the industry would bring to that, how much it would cost. It does seem to be cost effective to add this to our contracting. We included it in the Sykes Creek bid as well, and the numbers came in competitively. And so in working with the applicants for muck funding this year, both Indian Harbor Beach and Cocoa Beach were interested in doing what is necessary to modify their dredge processing so that they could strip these additional nutrients. And we certainly want to incentivize stripping as many nutrients out while we can. So we work to develop a financial incentive to do that extra nutrient removal and come up with a cost share equation to be consistent from project to project.
It seems to make sense since you have the water, you got to release it. I was curious, is the treatment passive? Did it just go through a filter of some sort, or is it more mechanical?
It depends on what you're treating. And there are multiple ways out there, and so multiple vendors are out there, marketing their approach. The phosphorus is mostly adsorbed, flocked and then adsorbed. The nitrogen is much more difficult, and the cheapest way is to use biological processes, but as you know, those are slow. So it's about enhancing those biological processes, and so there are multiple techniques out there, and since we've only done it once and had 2 other bids, we're at the front end of the learning curve, but it's an exciting new opportunity.
2 things. I think it would probably be easier if I just came in to meet with you, because Satellite Beach City Council is going to be talking about doing the preliminary engineering for the muck dredging in the Satellite Beach canals at their next meeting. And what they're going to be concerned with is, it's a city with a $10 million a year budget. So, the idea of the city actually even 40% or 20% of cost sharing that is completely out of the league of the city's financial ability to pay for that. And so the questions that, we would be asking is, when we're looking at muck dredging in itself, in at what point does that become a local government responsibility when we're looking at muck dredging in other areas of the river without local government without contribution? So it doesn't make sense to me of why they would have to participate, really, when they're not participating in any other way anywhere else. So, like, when you're looking at the Grand Canal in itself, and there's finger canals there in the county portion, what portion of the county's general fund is paying for that? And so that's what I would be asking. So that's the question that I would have for, with Cocoa Beach, Indian Harbor Beach, and Satellite Beach. There's the idea of doing preliminary engineering to kick it off and be partners, but at what point do does that kick in to be a city responsibility in funding those efforts when those efforts are not funded by a municipality anywhere else? So that, I think we need to think about that when we're looking at it, and maybe muck dredging, we don't look at muck dredging like we do stormwater or anything else, because there is no funding source in a municipal budget for muck dredging. You can't use stormwater funds, you can't use, utility, you can't use anything but general fund. So we're, when we looked at this tax, this tax was what we were looking at this for. So that, I think it would be a good idea if I did come and meet with you and we sit down and talk about just kind of like the fairness of it and how we distribute that between the counties and the cities.
It's more than fairness. The November ballot has a state initiative on it to double the basic homestead exemption. Winter is coming. Anytime we're talking about a collateral source that relies on ad valorem taxes at a local or other taxing district level, it ain't going to be there. And that will affect the ability of us to spend our money if we're looking for somebody who's got empty pockets.
I mean, we just went through, it's a struggle for us to even come up with $130,000 to do the preliminary engineering, because we have 2 hurricanes in 1 fiscal year. The $650,000 coming hit to our budget of that $25,000 homestead exemption. We don't have a utility to borrow from, which we did, but we don't. And so we have those, constraints, and I think you're going to see that in every beachside community and bigger communities. But not even financial constraints aside, just from a fairness standpoint, at what point does, we all have to contribute in the same manner, in my opinion. And so I think we need to talk through that.
Okay, good. I think, are we ready to move on to the Living Shoreline? Hi. Jane Hart.
Vinnie, you brought up the maps of living shorelines along private properties, that mapping, and we'll see that.
And private property too? Cool.
The whole shoreline.
Cool.
Except for the federal properties, which those are going to get picked up. UCF got a contract to finish those this year in the southern part of Mosquito Lagoon, so then we'll have a complete Brevard County shoreline map data on it. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jane Hart. I'm with Brevard County Natural Resources, and I'm here today. I want to provide an update on the Living Shorelines projects. First, I'd like to start and update you on the county projects that we've been working on for this past calendar year. We've had a lot of activity, and I just want to highlight some of the accomplishments that we've had briefly. We finished up the St. Johns River Water Management Cost Share Project, where we installed over 2,300 linear feet of oyster reef into the lagoon. 5 of those reefs were installed in 2017, and you might have seen on the news our last one, it culminated with the Kiwanis Park at Geiger Point oyster reef build, which is the longest oyster reef now installed in Brevard County. We're getting monitoring data from the reefs that were built the year prior, because this was a 2-year contract, and we're getting good data on the reefs. That they're indicating that they're all meeting minimum success standards. So we are, optimistic that we are heading in the right direction. They are showing good signs of success. The new oyster gardening season is underway, and we're getting good reports back from the Brevard Zoo. They conduct site visits. They go out to gardeners' docks, and they check on the oysters, and they said that this year is a phenomenally good year for growing oysters. They must like all of what they have to eat, and so we're anticipating over 180,000 oysters coming back this year to put out onto the reefs that we build. Also, shell recycling continues. We have a grant through DEP that will continue funding that through June of 2018. And the Brevard Zoo continues to grow the Shuck and Share program, adding on restaurants to recycle their shell.
And then we're also exploring new methodologies for our base layers of reefs so that we can conserve this valuable resource. We also completed the Brevard County Shoreline Survey and Mapping Project. If you recall, last time I was here in May, there was also Dr. Melinda Donnelly was here, and she talked about the mapping project and what the UCF was doing. And they conducted the survey. It ended up to be over 275 miles of shoreline that they covered. They took survey points every 100 feet in developed areas, every 1,000 feet in undeveloped areas, and they collected a lot of data. I wanted to show you, there's a couple really significant findings that was interesting, so I mapped it and I wanted to show you guys. So this is the edge type, because edge type is very important. You got to factor that into your living shoreline design. One surprising discovery was that, was that 61% of Brevard County shoreline is already hard armored, either with a vertical seawall or bulkhead or with a hardened sloped like a rock revetment. So, and the majority of the seawall properties are residential. 71% are residential. So we need to think about both those items as we move forward. Also, oyster presence was one of the data categories that they collected and noted whether the oysters were present or absent at each of those data points. And all of the green dots are where oysters were noted along the shoreline, if they were on dock pilings or if they had recruited onto rock revetment. And if you notice, it's basically about 520, State Road 528 and south. So it's going to be a challenge in the northern part of the lagoon, but we do have a lot of oyster recruitment from 528 south. And then I was thinking back, well, in the first couple years of oyster gardening, the site visit data, the zoo also collects whether at the end of the docks if oysters recruited onto the oyster gardens. And so we pulled up that data and I added it to the map. And in 2014 and 2015, if you notice that we did have some recruitment on docks as north as Titusville. So it is sparse, but there's recruitment, and that shows that there is a larval pool somewhere in the lagoon. And if we can just keep seeding these oyster reefs and work our way north, that eventually we will have it covered. I overlaid the projects. These are all the Living Shoreline projects. You can't really differentiate it between they're in the blue.
All the projects that were proposed as substitute projects for this year that are in your packet.
And the current projects that we have slated for year one. So it's year one and year two Living Shoreline projects are in blue, and overlaid them on top of where we have the oyster recruitment. So if you notice, all the projects are around the 528 area and south. Oysters, just as a reminder, they provide these wonderful water quality benefits, filtration, and nutrient removal. And we now have the results of the denitrification study from Mosquito Lagoon that we can now use to calculate the nutrient removal benefits. Oh, can I go back? Well, if you probably couldn't see on that. Thank you. There's also, on the symbols, there was oyster reef projects or the circles, and there's also Living Shoreline planting projects. You might have noticed in your agenda packages that there were 4 submittals for shoreline planting projects, and we just want to encourage planting projects because they also provide a lot of beneficial nutrient removal, water quality benefits, as well as they protect against erosion. They provide habitat for many species. They also sequester carbon, and they're just really pretty. So we want to encourage vegetative living shorelines as part of the plan as well. And the vegetative living shorelines, they remove pollutants in 3 basic ways. sediment prevention, the denitrification associated with the vegetation, and then also the nutrient uptake into the plants. And these were calculated in a study by up in Chesapeake Bay. And so we have the nutrient removal rates, and the study that was conducted in Chesapeake Bay was on 6 stream sites, and the average width of each of those sites was approximately 24 feet. And we just estimate that the shoreline plantings that would probably be installed in Brevard County would be wouldn't be as wide as that. So we estimated it would probably be about a third of the rate for Brevard County living shorelines.
A third of the nutrient removal benefit.
And so here are all the projects. I zoomed in to show you a little bit closer up of where all the projects are located. Again, the circles are the oyster reef projects, and the triangles are the shoreline planting projects. We have also included on there the 4 current projects. Brevard County has 1 in each of the sublagoons, and then remember the city of Palm Bay, Turkey Creek, that was approved last year as a substitute project. That is also on there. There's 14 project submittals that are also on there for year 2, and then I have broken them down by oyster reef living shoreline projects and also the vegetative living shoreline projects. And the oyster reef living shoreline projects, the submittals totals to about 1.6 miles of shoreline to consider. So it's less than the 2 miles, but it's a lot of great projects, and I'm glad that you're considering them. And I'm ready for questions.
Go ahead, John.
In the past, I seem to recall some concern whether or not we'd be able to spend, $20 million on living shoreline, that the projects were not coming in very fast, very extensive. Is that still a limiting factor? Do we need to get more living shoreline projects to sop up the money? Question to you, probably.
So the target was 2 miles a year,
Yep.
and this applicant pool includes, it was almost 1.7 miles.
Okay.
And so the difference we will make up with Jane implementing county contracted projects. At least that's our plan for now. And so we encourage more applications, but I think to go from a little over a quarter of a mile or a half a mile last year to 2 miles, it's a big jump. And so if it takes us a little bit longer to get there, we're well on our way.
Sounds like it's being exceptionally well managed.
Well, Jane's done a lot of work trying to come up with, what is the actual nutrient removal benefit of oysters as breakwater reefs in the Indian River Lagoon. And we now have studies that provide data specific to here, and so we will incorporate that data into the next update of the plan. The plan was written before we had those results, and so we used Chesapeake Bay data for that. We now have requests for living shorelines. We don't have much living shoreline data specific to here, so again, we're going to Chesapeake Bay, where the best available data exists, and used those values to come up with what should the cost share be for these living shoreline requests that are before you today.
I have 3 questions. Jane, first one, is there any, or has there been any upland living shoreline keeping track, like as far as vegetation and plants and stuff that are planted just up from the shoreline? I know you guys have your living shoreline and the vegetation living shoreline. I just think that and an upland living shoreline, I think it's all one big system, and I just didn't know if there was any mapping of that being done in the county or any plans to.
Well, in the survey data that UCF, they collected vegetation data. Is that what you're mean?
This is what I'm
down the slope.
Yeah, so this is what I'm guessing is like the vegetation and living shoreline is at the water line going down. Upland is from the water line up, so you're catching all your runoff that runs directly into the lagoon for people that have that was at 61% hardened, armored walls, they would be the ones that would probably most benefit from an upland living shoreline because they're going to have all the nutrient loads and stuff reduced before the water runs into the lagoon. I just didn't know if there was any data like that being collected.
You want me to jump there? Okay. There is, and Anthony just met with a new professor at University of Florida who is starting some studies like that, and Bethune-Cookman has a rain simulator, and they have been simulating rain on those upland buffers next to stormwater ponds, and so that data is of interest, and people are beginning to collect it, and we will, continue to try to gather it as it's available, and we may try to work with them to speed up some of that data collection that we...
So the whole reason that I ask is now everyone in the county knows about oysters and the living shoreline, and it's all about getting the conversation and getting vocabulary out there. I think one of the things we're going to need to do is either break down all 61% of those walls, which probably isn't going to happen, or help people understand that the upland living shorelines is really what's going to be needed in a situation like that. So,
and also at the seawall sites, there's designs, they're calling them on the west coast of Florida and even on the east coast, it's a new terminology that I just found out, they're called it redeemed seawalls, where, yes, people are probably going to remove their seawall to put in a living shoreline, but they can green it up by either putting an oyster reef in front of it, like an oyster reef revetment, or, like you said, a vegetative buffer along the top. So, yeah, those are both excellent, ways to green up and remove nutrients before they enter the lagoon.
Cool, yeah.
And if you notice in the package, there were 4 of the project sites for oyster reefs are at seawalls.
Yeah.
So that will be oyster reef revetments based on the FIT designs that they tested in their wave tank.
Okay, cool.
They had some good presentations last week at the Indian Harbor
for
symposium that addressed this very topic and included some videos from FIT lab showing the benefits even in a seawall situation with the oyster.
They significantly reduce wave energy.
I think Dr. Weaver showed us that, like one of the first groups we had.
Showed very similar.
Yeah. I had 2 more. John, do you?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Jane, is that map that you have, is that available online for anyone to take a look? And with
Could we put that on the website?
Flags or options?
We can put it on the website. We're also still working on the public map for the shoreline data, and we should be, releasing that in the near future, sooner than later. Megan Brand, our volunteer, is helping me find the time to get that out.
Okay, and then the last thing, it seems to me that I know Dr. Jacoby was talking about the brown algae in the northern Indian River Lagoon, and that seems to be the area, or the Banana River, where we have almost no oysters, or very little comparatively. So for me, it seems like a natural. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Well, first, I just want to point out that in the northern part of the Banana River Lagoon, that is a lot of federal area, and the UCF didn't do the shoreline survey up there, so we don't have any oyster data for that. But yes, there's brown tide in the Banana River right now, but as part of the symposium, the presentations last week, there's been some research, and oysters will eat brown tide. They like to eat it, and up to certain levels, they will consume it and can.
Which to me seems funny because it seems like such an easy, low-hanging fruit. If we've got an area that's got an abundance of brown tide, yet there's an area where there aren't any oysters, it seems like 1 + 1 = 2. I didn't know, maybe next year when we focus on our 2 miles, if that's an area that we want to particularly focus on for the living shoreline. Sorry, John, go. I'm done.
Go ahead.
Quickly, when the living shoreline is finished, how will you gauge success and what I'm going for? Can we measure at a specific site how much nitrogen's been taken up, or are we going to use the numbers from Chesapeake Bay or elsewhere?
That's an excellent question.
So we will be monitoring the density of oysters, the survival rates of oysters on these reefs and recruitment to these reefs. We would not plan to do denitrification studies unless you really think, I mean, I think we gather that in Mosquito Lagoon. It's expensive work to do. It requires very specialized equipment. We could do some more of the sequestration measurements if you're interested in the nutrients taken up by the oysters.
I'm okay with it. I was asking for somebody who couldn't come today.
Okay. Yes, our intent is to contract with, and I've had this conversation with the zoo, the intent is to contract with a third party to monitor the survival and recruitment on these reefs. And we believe that with that data, we can extrapolate the nutrient removal.
Thank you.
Okay, and John?
Do we have trouble getting cooperation, data access from the feds, from NASA, and from the United States Air Force on this and in general? I mean, they keep turning in black areas on maps. They got a lot of people that get paid to do the same sort of thing. How's our interface with the feds, the local feds?
We don't speak to them a lot, but they are on board, and as Jane mentioned, there is a contract to get that shoreline mapped, and you know, we intend to work with them. We're on the steep getting started curve, and it's easier to work with non-federal partners than federal partners as we get started.
If you run into any barriers at all, that would be of interest to this group and to me personally.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And Jane, I have a question about scale. You know, a number of the proposals were individual properties versus some larger areas. I don't recall the footage offhand, but does that, how does that impact, how do you anticipate that would impact long-term success?
Well, just from the results of the shoreline survey, and there's a lot of lagoon front property is residential, and so it's going to be parcel by parcel unless we had bigger strips of public land, like the Eels project is probably what you're talking about. That was a significantly large linear feet of shoreline project.
Well, I was just thinking that there were a couple where properties had grouped together and were doing this.
HOAs.
And if there were more, and you could even do that in other neighborhoods, it wouldn't even have to be an HOA, but where a neighborhood determined they were, you know, really make an effort to do this, would that project be more attractive to us than a number of individual projects?
When you when we go into permitting, though, there's the magic number is 500 feet of shoreline that is covered in the new Nationwide 54 for the Army Corps. They will permit a living shoreline and sign off up to 500 feet. Beyond that, it would require additional review or go out for National Marine Fisheries review, which could take a lot of time. So if we want a quick project implementation, any shoreline length less than 500 feet is going to get permitted quicker.
Okay.
It's huge. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there, Virginia, real quick, and I know it's not to Jane, but is there any way we can work with that 500-foot limit? I mean, we're working with the Army Corps when doing the larger dredging permit, right? So is there any way we could call some of these groups together and say, look, we've got areas that might be longer than 500 as long as it's within the Lagoon Basin?
So
Can we
the
do it?
500-foot limit, that easy permitting process was just created less than 2 years ago. Yeah, okay.
March 17th.
And so the issue is getting enough of these projects to come forward that the reviewers have seen them and get comfortable with
They sign
them.
right off.
And then hopefully, you know, that limitation will
Okay, thank you.
loosen up.
Okay, so we're moving on to the updated project action list.
So you have your sample motion that's worked well in the past, should have been on the table.
I do.
And you have the summary list with numbered items.
I don't have my list.
Okay.
I didn't bring mine.
Can I move that the Save Our Indian River Lagoon Project Plan Oversight Committee recommend modification of the Save Our Indian River Lagoon Project Plan to include all the projects listed in the February 2018 project action list?
I second it. You can have it.
Discussion?
Yes, I have a clarification.
I think Courtney had her hand up.
Does that, so those are the projects, and that totals, those are totaling about 22 million. I'm sorry, I don't have my list with me.
Yes.
So that, are we going to be adding it to the current projects that are in the plan, or are we going to be substituting projects? Is that, are we voting on that, or are we just voting on the project so far?
Maybe it'd be good to take it in two steps.
Okay.
And so in addition to the substitute project requests that are on this list, there's also the additional 1.1 million expansion of education and outreach, and the reserve of 840,000 for potential sewer lateral repair replacement for the private customer side.
What about the contingency?
The contingency is not in this list.
Okay. Is that in the plan, or is that something we have to add?
That's another agenda item later on.
Understood. Okay.
Okay.
Let me try the same thing. I'm still not sure we're there. You have a certain list of projects in the plan for year 2, and there's being nothing done to subtract from that list, as well as I know. These are on top of that. They're not substitutes, they're added projects.
But we haven't talked about that yet.
That is not.
They were submitted as substitute projects. So if you could decide whether you like all of these projects, or if there are any of them that you don't like, or any of the cost shares that you don't like, that's one step. And then if you want us to try to fund them as additional projects instead of substitute projects, I would prefer that be a separate direction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have a preference?
I think we should use all available dollars as quickly as...
Yes.
I like
Agreed.
I like my thing.
Okay, do we have other discussion?
So I know the reserves is later, but if we approve these projects, then all the money is spoken for, but we're supposed to be able to be pulling out 10% that isn't spoken for.
Not yet, because...
So the 22 million that will come in ahead of schedule by September 30th.
Yeah.
That's this fiscal year.
Yes.
These projects are
2 and 3.
proposed for next fiscal year.
Okay.
So I would like your direction to work with these applicants and try to get started on any of these projects that they can get going this year. Amend our current year budget to acknowledge those additional revenues that we expect to come in and apply them to getting started on any of these projects that are ready to go. And then we would add the remainder to the year 2 project list, or the year 2 column in the plan, and as well as address the contingency issue. So I think there's dollars available for everything.
Okay. So basically, we're going to vote on whether we like this list, and we think that this list should be started as soon as possible. That's what we're voting on right now, correct? Yes?
You need separate authority to pull from year 2 list into this.
That would help me with my budget amendment request to the county commission.
Then I'd offer an amendment to the main motion that says that this committee also approves efforts to pull year 2 dollars from this list into year 1. I'll look for a second.
Okay, so we're going...
Let's vote on that.
So we're going to vote on the amendment first. I don't think I need to read it again. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The amendment passes, or the motion passes, and the amendment. All those in favor?
Public comment?
Ah, okay. Yes, Mary.
Mary Spar. I'd just like to ask a couple questions about this. I've read over these projects, and first of all, the expanded education. How would we go about possibly expanding some of these expanded initiatives? In particular, there's one that I think really has a lot of potential, and it's a stormwater pond, because it's going to work with homeowners association. And in the write-up, it stressed that during the focus groups, they would look for other ways that the homeowners might be able to reduce their nutrient input. And so would that, if the committee decided to recommend an increase, for example, in that particular project, would that come later? I mean, maybe to next year?
Yes.
Okay, so we can think about that. And also here, I was also thinking that irrigation one with the watering, that might blend in with the stormwater pond. These homeowners associations are such a good focus, to really make a difference regarding nutrient loading and education. And the other question I have is, I looked over these projects, and you had asked on the matrix for an educational, does it have an educational component, and what that would be. And I looked over what the response is, and some of them had good, they had good educational components, but it was nothing that was kind of different from what they had done in the past, except maybe a bigger kiosk or something. And so when I think about this, in the past, the committee had said that they wanted the efforts of the Lagoon, to be recognized by the public. And I'm wondering if, in particular for the muck dredging, there could be some sort of an educational, community-based marketing outreach to those citizens that are living near these muck dredging projects as an educational component that would also, note that, this is a referendum-driven project. But it appears to me that the applicants really just don't have the money to do something big like that would really, speak to the citizens, get them to change their behavior so that they wouldn't be creating muck, in the future. Was that something that can be considered maybe in the future, to add that to the education? I'm sorry.
It's a great idea.
Can I just have 1 second more? I realize my time's up. Okay. At this particular point in time, you now have 0.5%, 0.5% that's going into educational, fertilizer education, and all these other educational initiatives, public outreach. That's 0.5%. I mean, you were at 1/5%. But it seems to me that, I heard the comments last time where, one member wanted $1 million a year on education. It seems to me that we could really step this up and do more with education, especially, concerning specific projects like a muck dredging and the stormwater pond, and continue the other projects as well, like the septic, making citizens aware of what they can do to improve their septic tank performance. Mm-hmm. Okay, so thanks.
Agreed.
If I could, I think there's, I think there's two sets of answers to the good points that Mary raises. If we're throwing extra bucks in here for communications, community outreach, education, I think there's significant flexibility to do the sorts of things you're talking about. The more important point that I hear, and I think it bears on year 3 and out, not this year, this year's in our lap, is how do we adjust the balance between the different piece parts that compose the budget? And from the viewpoint of somebody on this side of the table, I would guess that would be in response to excellent recommendations we get from staff on how to do things like pump money into education and so on. And the way they get their thoughts on that is a combination of direct liaison with them by interested parties and advocacy groups and presentations to us much earlier in the year ahead of budget time. If it looks like the amount of money we got for dredging ain't enough, or the amount of money we got for Living Shoreline is too much, or what have you, from the viewpoint of some interested outside party, we need to hear about that, and we need to have that filtered through staff recommendations, because they know the budget better than anybody else in this room. As far as a direct input, it could be a substitute project, but by and large, I think these entities are not those who submit substitute projects. They're not governmental groups or what have you. So that's how I think both your questions get answered is through advocacy early enough that it can filter through the staff and come to us as recommendations regarding budget.
Right.
I saw one other hand in the audience.
Can I speak on Mary's point
Yes.
first? Just to Mary's point, I had two things. First off, I had a visual in my head of some sort of splash mountain down Turkey Creek into a big pile of muck, and I think that would be a really cool educational piece that everybody would be excited about. That's year 4. We'll have muck mountain in Turkey Creek. But to your point, Mary, it is something I know that we've been talking about, and maybe. So education and outreach, and I know I was very happy to see all the projects checked yes for is there an education outreach component. I think that's fantastic. I think the thing is okay, well, what is education and outreach? And education is not that something is available, but why are you doing something one way, or how are you going to change long term? So I think that's a terminology, it's a learning curve situation. And one of the things I had mentioned briefly to Virginia is maybe in these RFQs that we're doing, maybe if we find some companies that we're working with that are really good with marketing or really good with advertising, that they can be a resource, or they can work with the municipalities or with the other, other agencies we're working with on these projects to say, okay, it's great you have a kiosk here, but let's get some outreach. Not have places where people have to go. Let's get some flyers out. Let's get some mailers out. Let's get some discussion going. So maybe if we can find, because you can't. I don't expect the municipalities to be expert in communicators. That's great to have, but they may not have that ability. So if we can identify somebody who does have that ability, if they can be a resource, or if we want to put money into that.
The thing about the municipalities, I think they all have professional communicators, but are there professional communicators involved in this process?
I agree.
And I'm wondering, there may even be an opportunity at some point to bring those people together, for another nonprofit to bring those together, and I'm sure that some of the nonprofits already have, but to actually get the municipalities to get their communications people in there too might be an improvement, an enhancement.
There's even an option or an opportunity for, out of this pool of money that we have for education, et cetera, to look at IDIQ contracts that the cities could tap into. We pay for the communications and education through task orders against this contract. And so this would connect them with the expertise that Vinny's talking about in a way that's funded, in a way that doesn't require a ton of bandwidth from the municipalities themselves.
Finally.
Sorry, Craig.
Hi, Craig Wallace, Torres Island, Satellite Beach. I've been attending these meetings since just about the beginning, and I've learned a lot. Thank you for all the invited guests. But I hadn't really noticed a trend, until I looked at this year's editions. And so I've got kind of an observation and a question. I actually had two questions, but Mary asked one question for me about the educational process. The observation I made is that we have a significant portion of the funds in the long-term budget, as well as the additions this year, allocated to muck dredging. And so I started thinking about some of the conversations we've had in presentations over the past, and I'm not an expert on muck, but John Treffery is. And in a conversation I had with John, we talked about the areas where muck is accumulated, and obviously muck kind of accumulates in the lower areas that have been dredged out for canals and so forth. But there's still muck in a lot of the areas in the lagoon, especially the Banana River Lagoon. And his comment was, if I could have my preference in terms of areas that I'd like to get rid of the muck, I would take a square mile of 6 inches of muck in the general Banana River Lagoon as opposed to dredging 5 feet of muck out of a canal or a lower area. So one of the questions I had is, when we look at the way we're factoring the nitrogen production or elimination by pulling the muck out, I think we're looking at it basically by like cubic yards of muck that we're, okay, good.
Per acre.
Okay, well, so is it the surface area that we're using as the factor, or is it
Right.
the, okay.
So what's in the plan and what is the basis of the original muck credit equation is based on area, and that's exactly, the reasoning that you just laid out, Treffery's preference for, if it's 6 inches thick, it's fluxing almost as much as if it was 6 meters deep. And so we want to reduce the amount of nutrients going into the water column by cleaning up the maximum area. So that's the flux reduction credit that we're getting. What we just talked about adding the interstitial water is because without that incentive, we are going to return a lot of nutrients back to the water column. And so that calculation is based on volume cubic yards, because that's what would be returned if we don't do this additional interstitial water treatment.
Okay, and that answers my question. And the question was more that, as we've, a lot of the projects we're going to be focusing on are pulling out like large volumes of muck out of canals. And so I don't know whether we have a way of balancing that between, and I know it's more difficult to pull 6 inches of muck out of a larger area than it is to pull 5 feet of muck out of a canal. But so the questioning is there any preferential equation that we can use that you're using to determine which projects to do?
Yeah, so it's that area calculation that is the preferential, and the majority of dollars in the plan go to the big open water dredging. There's just over 10% of the dredging dollars are designated for canals, and that's why the municipalities that are interested in dredging their canals have been looking at, what can we do to try to make our project area look more interesting? And the answer has been, get them shovel ready, go find additional grants, make them more cost competitive, because the plan is based on area and you've got a lot of muck in a very small area. The ongoing research that Dr. Treffery and the rest of the Florida Tech research team have been conducting is indicating that the percent of organics in many of these canal systems is much greater than the percent of organics in the big open water settings. And so the flux of nutrients is also greater in the canals than in the open water. And so we're having to sort of, rethink that prioritization, and the credit that we developed for this interstitial water tried to take that into account, looking at that density of nutrient concentration in the canal settings compared to. So we're trying to do both, and it's a learning curve.
Good, thank you. And so the other part of my question was the educational thing afterwards, because I'm on the Grand Canal. And after we do that muck dredging project, I want to make sure that everybody's trying to do their best to keep the muck from coming back in. So anything we can do on that, I'm all for it. Thank you.
Muck Mountain in the Grand Canal, coming soon.
And I think I just wanted to add to that, when we did the original plan, we were kind of surprised that the other canals weren't in there, and it was just the, area near Pineda that was in the plan, but understood that there was a limited amount of funding and that we wanted to go for the greater areas. I think the reason why the cities like Satellite Beach and Harbor Beach are now looking at, okay, well, maybe we should get it done, is because there is more funding than we thought was coming in. And the fact that if we just, you're already doing it, and you're already going to have them out there, so why not take advantage of that and get the whole thing done rather than skip it over and then maybe think, well, 5 years from now we should have done it, So since we have the extra funding coming in, that's where the thinking was on our part, is maybe we need to get it ready to see if that's viable.
I call a motion.
Okay, do you want to repeat your amendment?
The amendment's done. Did we vote on that yet?
The second part of it?
We're on the main motion.
Main motion as modified by the amendment.
Okay. Okay, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The amendment, the motion passes.
Can I just have a real quick question? Just real
Yeah.
quick. So you're going to go back and ask those applicants if we could get it started this year. And then we'll be looking at, we're going to go into the contingency plan, I understand that, but the 1.5 million in education, and then the other 800 and whatever thousand for the sewer line project, are those this year or next?
Yes.
Okay, so they're this year. So you'll come back with the amended budget for this year with all that in there and your recommendation of which projects are going to start. Okay, got it. Just checking.
And you
I'd wrap
have
my
the
head around that.
authority to do that without going to the commission?
No, we'll
Yeah,
have
we
to
have
go to the commission.
commission.
As a budget adjustment?
Correct.
Yes.
Not as a plan adjustment?
That's correct.
Okay, Stephanie.
I wanted to address the second part and move that we add these projects rather than substituting the projects, that we add them with the additional funds that are available.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Thank you.
That leaves us with a problem if we're successful in pulling year two stuff into year one. And that's a shortfall in spending in year two, which is what we're dealing with right now. How would you put that in contingency? What would you do with it? And it's an unknown amount.
Can I just make a real quick comment? Because it may be better if she went back to the applicants to see where they were, because a lot of them applied for year two, so they might not be ready to go right now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So even though it's good that we want to do that, it may be better to allow Virginia to check into that first before we move all that in.
Well, my question persists. Can you see a mechanism for us to spend year two money that doesn't stay in year two but rather moves to this year? Is that something, just shove it downstream and worry about it?
I still don't understand the question.
We just approved a bunch of year two stuff. We also approved an amendment as part of the main motion that we were going to try to haul as much of that as we can into year one. The amount that gets hauled into year one is a minus in year two spending. Our goal is to spend all of year two. Is there a mechanism to pick up that, if you would, savings in year two? Is that downstream and we'll worry about it then?
So there's already a plan for many projects to implement in year two, right, in the plan. So any of this new list that can't be completed this year or that rolls over into next year would be additional projects in year two as well. And I will actually need to amend our budget projections, not just this year, but in future years, to create additional, revenue room to fund these projects.
Pure money management.
Right.
Yeah.
Not a bad problem to have.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. I understand now.
I think we're at the draft list of update items.
So throughout the year, you've shared many ideas, and we've had comments from the public. We've tried to capture those along the way, and so this is just a quick bulleted list of the parts of the plan that we believe need to be updated to reflect that information conveyed to us in prior meetings. So if there was anything here that you didn't mean for us to do, we'd like to know that before we write it up. Otherwise, we will be incorporating these changes into the draft of the plan we bring to you next month.
Do you need a motion?
Where's
on that?
I just had
It's on page
No,
72 of 73.
it's at the end of the short forms.
Virginia, it says there's the one that says review and add language to the plan about septic system upgrades, and says the Florida Department of Health does not currently have a process to permit the bioabsorption. That line item that's there. So is the goal then to get them to be able to approve the process? Is that what?
So we certainly want DOH to approve their proposed rule changes that would allow these new technologies to be permitted.
Yeah.
But like we saw on the field trip, there are alternative septic systems, septic tanks that are permittable right now.
Okay.
But the plan was written for the passive drain field systems that aren't permittable now. So
Sorry.
this would broaden that language to, we don't really care whether you upgrade your tank or your drain field, as long as you are reducing nutrients coming out of your house and into the groundwater.
Then that's quote unquote an upgrade.
Yes.
Is what we're saying. Okay, got you.
Is this list all in-house, or has Tetra Tech been involved?
This is, actually Marcy drafted this list. It's Tetra Tech.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, no, I don't think we need a motion. I just, and I guess if you have additional thoughts on this in the next week or so, we'd appreciate that. We want to bring you what you want to see next month, so we're trying to guess what that would be.
You just want our promise we won't barf on it next month. Okay.
It's a big undertaking, so.
Okay, so if we go to the Seagrass proposal.
So while Dr. Jacoby pulls up his next PowerPoint, you'll recall that we had a panel here that talked about seagrass, and we were very excited about the potential for incorporating seagrass restoration into the plan, and so I asked him to come speak to that today.
So, yeah, you may remember there were several people that were on the panel, including some of the staff that worked with me. We have tried to pull together, I guess, what I would call the experts in replanting seagrass in particular, and that proved to be more challenging than I'd hoped. So I may not speak for everyone that was involved in the process, but I think I speak for a fair number. And what I want to bring you today is kind of where we currently sit, at least at this point. So once again, the kind of motivating factor for a lot of this was the fact that we lost tens of thousands of acres of seagrass, which you saw in that slide. You'll see in a second. And along with that, you lose nature's benefits of variety, and we'll go over that a little bit, and that includes the cycling of nitrogen and phosphorus. And remember that word cycling, because that's going to be an important part of it. Because of the scale of the loss, there's concern that the recovery rate will be too slow, or slower than people wish, and so help may be needed, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. I'll give you the bottom line right now, and the fact is we're not ready yet, and that algal bloom presentation from a little while ago gives you an idea of why. So if we can't remove the issue that caused the loss of seagrass, there's probably no point in putting some back there right at this point. But kind of along the lines of keeping a focus and not getting scattered, but in my mind it's also doing things now. So feed, clothe, and house the kids today, but invest in their college education. And that's a little bit what I think we're talking about here, is 5, 7, 10 years from now, we may be in a position where we want to do something about seagrasses. And if we don't prepare for that, it'll be 5, 7, 10 years down the road before we can effectively do anything. All right, so just again, the quick, you've seen this before. That's the graph that shows you the extent of seagrass in acres, and you can see the loss in 2011. That was the super bloom year. You can see that seagrass has tried to come back in 2013 and 15. But what we think is going on at this point is the blooms in 2016 and some of the conditions in 2017, based on transect length taken in the summers at about 100 places. We don't anticipate there to be an increase in seagrasses in the 2017 maps, which will be ready in a couple of months. So based on the fact that the transect length and the extent, the aerial extent, that acres of seagrass correlate really well, we don't expect there to be expanded seagrasses.
So the line will stay the same, Dr. Jacoby, as in 2015, is that what you're saying?
Down.
It's possible that it will go down. So, you can see in 2016, transect length dropped pretty dramatically, and a lot of that was up in Mosquito Lagoon, which up until that time had kind of missed the blooms in the growing season, but that got hammered pretty badly. So this is, again, lagoon-wide, so we sort of anticipate potentially less acreage than even in 2013. So.
Thank you.
Along with that, you've heard this dozens of times, I'm sure, if not more. Variety of benefits that are derived, and potentially just go down here to the bottom line. So with a loss of 22,000 acres, if you use these kinds of numbers to generate your benefits, you're talking about $270 million a year of lost sort of benefit. One of the things that was lost is the cycling of nutrients by seagrasses. Now, for seagrasses in general, we wouldn't think of this as removal, right? You're not likely to harvest seagrasses to pull the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the system. But what the seagrasses tend to do is they cycle at a different pace from some of the other things that use the same nutrients, much slower than the phytoplankton. And again, significantly slower than, say, the drift algae, which again are a major player in cycling nutrients in the lagoon. So that's part of what's changed in the way the lagoon behaves, because you've kind of lost that anchor, as it were, that stabilizer. So what we've tried to do is because the cycling issue is hard to get a handle on, that varies quite a bit with a variety of conditions. But what we've tried to estimate is the nitrogen and phosphorus, the NNP, that's in the standing stock of seagrass, as we call it. What's out there when you have seagrasses at a certain level. That basically assumes that the kind of uptake and release rates are about equal. So, you get seagrasses pulling nutrients out of the water column, and then they die and they release some nutrients back. So we're just treating that as a wash. And then what we tried to estimate was what happened when we lost those tens of thousands of acres of seagrass. What did that do to the nutrient budget of the lagoon? And again, this is a big table with a lot of stuff in here. The way we did that was go through the amount of acres, that's acres in thousands, pounds per 100 acres, and then pounds total. And so this is kind of where you want to go right now, I think. So the total that was wrapped up in seagrasses back when they were good was sort of 25 million pounds of actual seagrass, 580,000 pounds of nitrogen, and about 58 pounds of phosphorus. In general, seagrass nutrient content is about 10 to 1, nitrogen to phosphorus. And so when you had a loss, right, of about 22,000 acres, these are the kinds of things that those nutrients became available for something else, like phytoplankton to use. And so if you were trying to restore it, that's what you'd be trying to grab back and pull it into seagrasses. And those numbers, they're in the ballpark of the reductions that are in the TMDL. I mean, those are numbers that are worth taking a look at. So natural recruitment, why not just let seagrasses come back? You saw in those mapping years that they tried, and they do. They tried to grow back where they were. One concern is the extent of the loss. The fact that there aren't patches where you can get recruitment. So the seagrasses that tend to be in the lagoon don't produce a lot of viable seeds. They do produce seeds, but they mostly spread through runners. So they're going to grow into areas. So if there's no seagrass nearby to grow in, that area may not fill in very rapidly. The other concern is that there's so much loss that the sediments now are subject to a lot more disturbance. We seem to be seeing higher turbidities in places where seagrasses are lost. And they need to have some stability of the sediment in order to get a grip. So again, they may need some help in the future. And probably the third thing is that, because there are things that do eat seagrasses, any seagrasses that recruit are going to be subject to fairly heavy grazing because there's not a lot of food out there for the things that are looking for it. So what would I say to you folks? I'd say that you might want to consider somehow folding seagrasses into the way you think about the world. So somehow get the thinking into the plan, much like oysters and some of the other biological elements. Remember that this is cycling. So your metric of nitrogen and phosphorus removed, pounds removed, may not fit as nicely here. You may have to revise the way you think about the world. And then I'd say think about how you could invest in developing the capability to do this. So this is, I hope, trying to balance, keeping your focus and, getting ready for something that you didn't anticipate early on. Kind of harken back to that whole phytoplankton thing. It's the same sort of issue. We may not need it today, but we may need it or want it in the future. So the water quality is not suitable for planting at this point. The technology, the ability to plant at the scale that we're talking about really hasn't been done. So tens to hundreds of acres have been mitigated, which is essentially moved. So somebody's going to do something. It's going to go over the top of a seagrass bed. They have fairly effectively picked up the seagrasses and moved them someplace else, right? But they haven't, that's not new. That's just trying to save what you had, as it were. Hundreds of acres in some places up Chesapeake and north have been done with seeds. They broadcast seeds. For Zostra, that's a species that seeds and grows from seed fairly well. We're probably not going to be able to do that here. Tens of acres have been planted, and that's typically at less than 1% cover, oftentimes less than 0.5% cover. So 3 foot to 6 foot centers. So there's a sprig and a sprig 6 feet apart, and they just wait for it to grow in. Now that may work on tens of acres. That is very unlikely to work on tens of thousands of acres. So the other thing would be to go ahead and maybe have what I would call a summit. So we've had one, we had what I call a loading summit to take a look at what we now know about loads that we didn't know back when we did a lot of things that started this process. Generally speaking, the landscape down in this region in terms of who the major players are and who's doing what has changed dramatically within the last few years. The NEP is being reconstituted. They're trying to redo their CCMP. You guys are way ahead of most folks. Other players like the district, we need to figure out how to go in that mix. So I would say that holding these kinds of meetings of the minds would be a valuable contribution, whether it's sponsored from this group or sponsored in conjunction with other groups. Certainly one on how we would do seagrass restoration would, I think, add value. The concept of the summit in my mind is you agree on what you know, what you don't know, and how you're going to try to figure out those issues. Yep. So some of the things that we're talking about here probably are the nursery. You don't want to be going out and taking seagrasses from somewhere where there are a few and trying to put them someplace else. That's not a net gain in most cases. There are issues about, well, what exactly, if you're going to plant something, what do you plant? Is it a single sprig? Is it a group in a pot? How do you do that? What's the best way? Can you find things that will promote growth? There's some indication that people have, there are a variety of, not nutrients so much as other things that may help the seagrasses grow faster. What do we need for protection? What do we need for protection from the grazers? A lot of the seagrasses that gets planted goes in cages. Now you can't do that on tens of thousands of acres. That's just not feasible. So how much is grazing an issue? What just about the protection from just disturbance from waves, boat wakes or wind waves or whatever it might be? How do you select sites? How do you know where to go first? Are there ways to do that? And we've been working on that, and we have some criteria we tried to pull together. And then are there non-planting methods? I mean, can you go somewhere and just protect a shoreline where there might be a bit of seagrass and help it spread? And so those kinds of things would be the issues that would be brought up. And hopefully you come up with a plan. And before I stop, I think there are a couple other ones that I would throw in the mix in terms of these summits. Monitoring is certainly one. I think several people have talked about trying to get people together to talk about monitoring. And I'll go back to the question of what will continue. And I'll tell you that the sampling that gave us the types of phytoplankton, that's going to be zeroed out in the upcoming budget. Modeling, I think, is another one. So there's modeling going on funded by this group. The district has a model. Folks at Harbor Branch have models. And probably what we need to do is, again, get folks together and say, what do we have? How can we best use it? There's nothing wrong with having several models that try to do the same thing. That's your hurricane predictions, right? I mean, you don't just have one. They all have slightly different approaches and slightly different assumptions. But there may be ways that we can take someone who's working on something that's overly redundant and move them onto something else. And it's certainly just to be able to link some of these things. And I'll leave it there.
Who do you think should convene this summit, and what's ideal time?
I'm not too concerned about who convenes them. I don't know that they cost a lot of money if you can find the room and so forth. I think a lot of the people will show up on their own. I think it's the drive to do something with it that's where the rub comes. So,
who should do it? Who should write the first email?
I'm happy to do some. I'm happy to work with other folks to do some.
Volunteer.
So we've done, like I said, we did a loading summit, and we're following up on that. And I've certainly talked with Dwayne a couple times about a monitoring summit. He's a little busy right now, so he said maybe we can hold that one for a bit.
You said that the water quality isn't good enough right now, but it's not consistent throughout the lagoon. Are there areas where the water quality is better and that we might invest in a little bit of planting at this time?
Right at this point, I'd probably say no.
Okay.
Just because of the way that things have been going in the last few years. So, for example, the fact that the brown tide came as far south as it has this time, which was down past here down to around Vero, we hadn't seen that before. So right now, I think we're still struggling with our water quality.
Dr. Jacoby, so along that point, there was an idea I had before and I brought up. I wish I could design some sort of little mini box that I could put in the river and it would tell me what the load is within like a meter around it. But with all these oyster beds that are being laid, do you think that the areas just around those oyster beds, that they would be able to support seagrass? And is that something that maybe the zoo or whoever is doing shorelines could look into incorporating with their oysters? Because if the oysters are keeping the area, I'm thinking volumetrically. So the area, the water just around those oyster beds, if they're cleaning that water, is that clean enough to support planting? And if so, is that something that could be added to the living shorelines to start dressing the children?
So, people are adding that to their sort of efforts with Living Shoreline. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing, and it may work on that scale. But again, you got to recognize the difference in scales. So, that's less parts of an acre, and we're talking tens of thousands of acres. So, I mean, I would not stop anyone from doing it. I just think on a broad scale, right now, I wouldn't be gambling with my resources on planting seagrasses. So when I did my MBA, one of the courses was an entrepreneurship course, and the project that I kind of got asked to take part in was there was a couple of guys who wanted to use local oysters to grow black pearls to compete with the black pearl in the black pearl market. And so we did our little presentation, and one of the venture capitalists that was there came up to me afterwards. He said, "That was a really good job." He said, "But I'll tell you something, never invest in anything that's alive." And so that's what we're talking about with seagrasses here, right? It's risky business. And it's expensive, and we didn't go into costs, but just tens of acres can cost you $500,000 easy. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Walker, you're going to talk about the contingency plan, or?
Can I just follow up on the seagrass? So that was something that we had talked about incorporating in the next plan update. What we just heard is it's probably not a wise investment to spend dollars putting seagrass in the lagoon yet, but we need to be thinking about the future. So what I'd like to do is work to include some text in the plan about the importance of restoring seagrass and some of the challenges associated with that, so that we're not silent on the issue of seagrass restoration in the plan, but we're pacing ourselves accordingly.
Should we mention anything about participating in a summit? Or leave that on the side?
We can put that in there.
Karen, did you? Okay. Okay, Walker, do you want to lead us through the contingency plan?
Yes, so we were asked a few months ago to prepare a contingency funds plan. As I'm sure everyone here recognizes, not all things go as planned, and there's always going to be the potential that we're going to see cost overruns. The economy is really strong. We've seen a lot of construction cost increases over the last few years or so. So I would expect that with all the unknowns and variables associated with these projects, there's going to be projects where there's a cost overruns, hence the intent of the contingency funds reserve. So just a quick overview. Before I get into it, though, there is a figure. It's a flow chart, which is very helpful. It's much easier to follow than actually reading the plan, I would say. So this is a pretty good reference for if and when you're reading the plan. But the plan itself, so the intent is that we would develop and adopt each fiscal year 5% of the total trust fund dollars that are budgeted for all approved projects for that fiscal year. So essentially, we would take 5% of the total project value for that fiscal year and put it in a bank account, so to speak. And that money would sit there, and in the event that we have project partners or original project plans that experience cost overruns, we can tap that up to 10%. And there's a couple caveats there. Substitute projects, and I'm going to emphasize substitute projects, if there are overruns that exceed 10%, and there's cost overruns for anything associated with ancillary project components, and anything over 10%, the funding would not be, this contingency reserve funds would not be eligible for that particular cost overrun. There would be the eligibility for 10% above the estimated cost or eligible amount for projects that are in the original plan and the plan update. So that's it in a nutshell. We would follow county procurement policy. We have like Administrative Order 29. There's a few different board policies that we would apply. We're not trying to circumvent the procurement system or the procurement policies that we have. We would be required to follow the policies for specific dollar amounts associated with the changes and so on and so forth. That would also include the potential for some of it going before the board for approval and not just to the COC. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
We can take questions. John?
In the last sentence there, you said something, 10% above the estimated cost or eligible trust fund amount. Why are both of those in there? Couldn't you just use one or the other? I can't think of an example where you need to have that in there, but I'm not used to reading these legalese kinds of documents. Maybe you can clarify that for me.
We struggled with that language, trying to capture every scenario. So you have some projects, and there was one that somebody asked about where they asked for less than their eligible amount because their project was more cost effective than what was in the plan. So in that case, the 10% over the eligible amount isn't the right number. So
I never think about anybody asking for less.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I just have a comment real quick.
Yeah, Courtney.
So I agree with the 10% for substitute projects, because the substitute projects at that point should be somewhat current in terms of estimates, whereas in the plan, those estimates were done some time ago, and they were used an average construction cost for that type of project. So the 10% here, I would hope, I mean, I understand that we would go over. What is there a max, or are we just saying it could go over?
We're saying that if it's under 10%, then we have a streamlined process for amending our budget without having to take time out and go through some long, complicated process. If it's more than 10%, then we'll take time out.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
We'll evaluate, we'll bring it back to you, we'll bring it back to the board, we'll go the slow way. But we wanted to have a faster process for small deviations.
And that's for substitute projects?
It's for both.
For both?
For all.
Okay. Because for the ones in the plan, I could see it going over 10%. I just see that happening. So is that wise to make it that way, that we'd have to go back? Would that slow that project down, or should we just increase that percentage?
We could increase the percentage. The other thing that we can do in this update is factor in, not necessarily a CPI, there's an index for government and there's an index for construction, and I think we need to take these different project years and
update the plan every year.
Yeah.
Agreed. Because that's definitely, I mean, construction costs have drastically increased since we've created that plan. So I see that going over definitely. So, but, I mean, I would be fine with coming back through the process if that happens, but I just hope that doesn't slow that project down. And I think if we see that slowing the project down, then we need to revisit this policy and increase that percentage, Because, I mean, I understand it for substitute projects, but for the ones that are in the plan, those cost estimates are no longer, they're really not viable anymore, I have to say, So.
Is this approach to things precedented inside the county? Is this something that's done with other potential cost overruns? And has this been market tested with the inside money man, the people with green eye shades and sleeve garters, and has it been politically market tested?
It has gone through the budget office.
Okay.
It has not been politically tested. What typically happens is that you add a 10 to 20% contingency to every single project.
Exactly.
And we could do that. It would tie up a lot of dollars. Right now, we have dollars, so we could do that.
This is way better, more
But
efficient.
as we go forward and we have more projects than dollars, I'd rather not tie up that much money in every project.
And where would the allocation authority lie under the 10% cap? With you, with the Department of Natural Resources?
We would have the ability with the county manager and the budget office to amend the budget. The procurement, we wouldn't change anything about the procurement policy if we have to do a change order to a contractor that exceeds the county manager's signature authority of $100,000. That would still have to go to the county commission.
Do you need a motion from us?
Yes.
Wait, I think you're...
One other question. So the projects that we just moved as additional projects, are they subject to the 10%? Because they're new projects that, just like the substitute project, should probably be accurate in their assessment.
The way this is written, it would apply to everything going forward. If you don't want it to apply to this list of projects, we could write it for, after.
And I would say yes and no. I mean, they're newer, but some may not have engineering estimates yet. So those are the most accurate, but even now, bids are coming back in more than engineering estimates. So, so I would allow it to go forward. I mean, I would agree with that.
I would like to add just one thing. I know when we, if it's under the 10% and the county approves it, or the county doesn't approve it, regardless, I know that we will see it in the next month's agenda packet itemized out. It'll be listed because we'll be able to see how much was approved or wasn't. What I would ask is maybe there's an additional diamond. I like diamond shapes, but I'd make it like green, just a different color. I'm joking about that, but anyway, what I'd like to see is an acknowledgement that this project has been given a change order for a certain amount. So it's pulled out and it's made to our attention rather than just thrown into the rest of the documents that we normally look at.
Good suggestion, yeah.
And I wonder if another source of funding into this contingency might not be underruns and completed projects. Be a good place to throw the money.
Yeah.
I move that the committee endorse the contingency plan as presented.
Second. Okay, Charles? Okay. All those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, the motion passes. We're ready for general public comment. Yeah, look at that. It's 10 after 11. Yeah, my time's almost up, by the way. You know, we switched chairs in March. Yes.
Lorraine, can I make a public comment?
Yeah.
On behalf of the Brevard Indian River Lagoon Coalition, working in partnership with the Florida Tech Lagoon Research Institute, we've got a couple of events coming up that I want to share with you. The first one is Thursday of next week, February 22nd. Doors open at 6:30, first speaker at 7 o'clock. And this is primarily featuring a preview of the MRC report card. And while we're going to start off with the usual 5-minute summary talks from Dwayne and the NEP and from the county and from Florida Tech, the key focus is going to be on Lisa Soto doing a preview, and I keep in mind she's not going to release the entire report card. She's going to release a few little tidbits to pique interest. But the main thing that we wanted to talk about is the science behind it, why the science. A tremendous amount of work has gone into this to make sure that they're finding the right things for repeatable measurements so they can do measure the same things and provide a report card every 2 years as we see the lagoon improve. So for that one of the things that's been a little bit of a disappointment to me and some of the other organizers is that we see the same faces every time. That we're seeing, we're not really getting out beyond the environmental interested lagoon support crowd. So the challenge that I would put to you and others in the room here is, would you come and bring a friend that's not, that is a lagoon newbie, registration for that, we're trying to get an idea of how many people are coming, so it's on Eventbrite. It's free, of course, but we'd love to have people registered on Eventbrite, and it's lagoonreportcard.eventbrite.com. Okay, the other one is March 1st, and here's where we're taking some initiative to get out beyond the usual crowd. And we've got something called Lagoon and Lager at Hell and Blazes. And we've got 2 of the millennial organizations working with us on planning this. 321 Millennials and Engage are working with us to do this. And we're taking something of a millennial format on this. So we're going to have speakers in the back room. The back room holds about 40 or 45 people. The front room, the bar, holds 100 or so. So the format's going to be to have a speaker speak for 5 minutes about some topic of the Save Our Lagoon plan or lagoon restoration. Then answer questions in the back room for about 5 minutes, and then move into the bar, and if anybody wants to talk, have a beer and talk with that speaker, then that will be available in the main area of Hell and Blazes. So we're going to need 12 speakers. So we're looking for 5-minute speakers, people to do this 5-minute talk, and then be prepared for questions for about 5 minutes, and then talk to people over a beer. So that can't be too hard. If any of you are interested in doing that, please send me an email. It's vince@vincelam.com. So, that's just wanted to share these 2 with you, and I hope that you can help us enrich our participation in these.
Thank you, Vince. Yes.
I'm MJ Waters with the Brevard Indian River Lagoon Coalition, and I would add on to what Vince said, and if you could bring a guest who's under the age of 50, that would be especially appreciated. We're trying to lower the average age here. So I have 3 separate things I just want to comment on. One is about the sewage release issue and the utilities, and taking some funding from the plan to do that. And I commend you for your conservative approach to that, because there is concern of setting a precedent for, the utility provides a service. We pay a fee for the service. If they need more money, maybe they need to take a look at their own budgets instead of just reaching for another pot of money for that. So there is concern in the community about anything people see where they're perceiving that money is being taken from this for something else. So I just want to share that with you. Secondly, to your talk about education. This year, the coalition has funded 6 different awards for Lagoon Science Fair projects. I went a week ago and judged 30 projects that were all about the lagoon. And I have to tell you, these 9th graders are really smart. In the interim, we also have been contacted by the Brevard Youth Environmental Summit that they put on every summer. They want to expand it this year. So we met with them and talked about things like identify the president of the environmental club in every high school in Brevard County and try to get those kids to come, with the idea of creating a coalition of youth involved with lagoon issues. They are very excited about it, and in fact this year their speaker is from the Jane Goodall Roots and Shoots program, so I think they're going to get a really good response. And I gave them a lot of organizational names of people to contact to speak at that summit, because they really want it to be very interactive and fun. So there's those couple of things are already going on, and we said let's get some of those science fair winners to come. I mean, one of them was about measuring the lagoon quality of water at different depths vis-a-vis where we're putting the oysters, and I said we need to connect you with Florida Tech, and a lot of them have already reached out to Florida Tech and Harbor Branch to really dig into the science, so that's really super. My last thing is a question, and it's probably for the staff. Does the county have a crisis response plan for the next time we have a big fish kill, in terms of deploying resources instead of, KBB people with trash bags out there trying to pull the fish out? And if not, we would be happy to advocate for that, because I'm sure it's not within natural resources, but another department. So if you can let us know about that, we'd appreciate it.
So we've had that conversation a lot in the last few weeks as the brown tide is, cell counts have been going up in the Banana River. We've been watching the dissolved oxygen every night and through the wee hours of the morning, and it's
it's okay so far, but, you know, it's winter, the water's cool. So we have reviewed and we have contacted the agencies that helped respond to the fish kill last time and have sort of had those conversations about, are you ready? Do you remember what we did last time? You know, do you have your call trees ready to go? I think that we do now have an additional source of revenue that we didn't have before, and that the response of organizing volunteers with trash bags is maybe not what the public is going to expect from us this go-around. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on whether you think it's appropriate for operating funds from the lagoon to go towards assistance with cleanup if it is a major event. We're not talking about dead fish in one dead-end canal. We're talking about when, you know, large open waters go anoxic all at once and hundreds of thousands of fish are floating on the surface.
How much nitrogen would that remove? I think that's a good metric.
That would not be an insignificant number.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, everybody recommends to get it out, so yeah, I mean, that would definitely be in our interest.
I mean, that would still be leveraging the public interest and their assistance.
Right, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of walking the shoreline and picking things up between mangrove roots, that's going to take armies of volunteers. But if we have, you know, giant surfaces covered in dead fish, it's just not efficient to send people out there in their flats boats with a fish net, you know, a few fish at a time. We need all those, you know, large scooping things they use for litter in the Miami River and, you know, that sort of equipment.
But how quickly can you mobilize something like that?
Well, my direction staff was to contact FWC and contact Miami and find out what vendors they use and like, and then call those vendors and say, how fast can you get here, and find out who can get here the soonest, because I would consider that an emergency response that you do, you know, you take the fastest vendor.
Courtney?
I think with the information we heard today, that's what's a very good news. I think that's very insightful for the staff to be thinking this way, and I think that's a great idea. I mean, it's definitely in our realm of what we do, and from what I understand in the past, it was very important that we get it out, and I think that it's definitely a well thought out strategy.
Oh, Stephanie?
On the same lines, I had a citizen ask if there was any possibility in some of the canal areas, because that's where we saw a lot of the major fish kills, because it's smaller and the temperatures rise. Is it possible to aerate those, to bring in portable aeration systems to mitigate when we know that those oxygen levels are going down? Is that a possibility?
I think it is a possibility. The question is how much aeration and how much would those aerators cost, and, you know, how much energy would they use to aerate something, you know, the size of a canal. The technology that vendors are approaching us with, you know, every week we get more of them. The smallest units that they sell are on the order of, you know, $5,000 to $15,000. So they're not something that, you know, the regular homeowner is just going to go out and buy and put under their dock. So I think, you know, we need to find that single-family home size technology.
Or encourage canal members as a whole to go ahead and get one or two for a canal, because you split it up 8 ways, 16 ways, or whatever, it makes it more affordable. But along with the question of the emergency thing, for me, it's almost like there's a substitution project. It is a substitution project. It's not a good one, but an opportunity presents itself where there's a nitrogen removal that we're going to be aware of. So I don't see why we wouldn't do it, but I would like to see maybe Anthony's fantastic writing, or was that Brandon that drafted up the documents actually detailing with some scientific data what type of removal we would be getting. And I think that way just kind of bases it in science like all our other decisions.
Yeah, Todd.
I agree with that. I think the data piece is important on it, and I really struggle with this one though, personally, just because unlike everything else we do, this is such a short-lived transitional impact. Everything else we're doing has impacts that are, if not years, it's decades or longer, and that's just not the case here. And there's a function of government that's emergency response. And I really struggle with this one. Personally, I agree it's got to be done. We need to do it better. I'm on the fence personally on, I'd hate to see this, that over the next 10 years, if this happens 3 times, that we just continue to spend money that deals with just that point in time and is taking away from something that is fixing us for the long run. So. Doesn't mean I think it's necessarily a bad thing. It's just it doesn't feel completely right in the context of everything else we're doing.
Yeah,
but that's one opinion.
Charlie?
Yeah, and I have similar opinions to Todd. I mean, it's like you always have a contract with a company to do spill cleanup. You have that there as a contingency. Maybe it's like muck removal when you start taking out the dead fish and other organisms in a way. I mean, you're trying to remove something that's not supposed to be there any longer. So it is kind of a slippery slope, though, because we want to make sure we're directing our money for the long term.
So Virginia, what would happen if there was some sort of spill in the lagoon that was negative? I don't know, oil, chemical. What would happen? Who would respond?
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard would respond?
With oil booms and, when the Deepwater Horizon happened in the Gulf, and everyone was doing modeling, and there was potential for that to get entrained in the Gulf Stream and work its way up our coast and get sucked in through the inlets into the lagoon. And so there were plans developed with the Coast Guard for how we would respond to that.
Would it be worthwhile to have a conversation with the Coast Guard about? I mean, I know federal budgets are getting slashed here and there, but would that be beneficial to have a conversation about them, just with them, to see what they?
I know the Coast Guard Auxiliary is particularly interested in how they could help with the lagoon, so we could have that conversation with them about what they might be able to bring to the table.
Okay.
Since we're talking about updating the lagoon plan, I wonder if it might not be useful, hearkening to this discussion and what Marilyn said and so on, that there be some statement in there of eloquently worded that we're not Lagoon 911. And that these funds are fully allocated for the next, in this now 9 years, and that just some assertion that perhaps we can get the county commission to sign off on, that we are not a source of emergency funds except as budgeted in the lagoon plan. And if you want to use them, wait till next year when we update the lagoon plan and present it and so on. I don't know how you'd say that, but it might be a buffer.
Yeah.
I agree. I don't think we want to do this every day. But the point is, I think, is that the last time we had a fish kill, most of the fish that were removed were all removed by volunteers, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. But most of them went and sunk down into the bottom of the lagoon, which is not good.
Right.
So, unless we go get it, we're defeating everything we're trying to do. So, I understand that we don't want to spend money on responding to an emergency, but it would be like winding back the clock, if you will, if we don't. So there, nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to respond to something like this. We hope it doesn't happen, but it would be, I think, detrimental to us if we didn't get the fish out. I mean, I don't think that's a good idea, is to leave it. And that's what they tell you. We called Fish and Wildlife and everyone else, and they all said, "Oh, let them sink." So there was no state resources for us to go to get that out. So I think it's a good idea to have it there in case we need it. But I agree. I mean, nobody wants to do this all the time, and we hope we don't have to. But there's really no other funding source unless we want to reach into the county budget and the city budgets.
maybe we need to figure out how we can best work with the Coast Guard, too, how, if we put them on alert and they're upping their effort, or at least it's on their radar screen. Todd?
Just to add to that, and back to the being on the fence comment, I entirely think that it may be something that we just need to do because it's not happening. But putting that in the context of how do we get past this point, because that isn't, we need to be figuring out how to put this to better use, and at some point the county and others, we need to figure out some way to step up.
This sounds like a county manager question, though, for openers. It's not our fish kill, it's the county's fish kill. And how would he like to see contingency plans and so on packaged? We're an able source of money, but in the long run, I think your concerns are in the right direction.
I totally agree with you. I mean, I just wanted to raise the issue. I did not assume this body should take responsibility for this.
You need to step up to the home audience.
Think about this. What if overnight every single bird in Brevard County died and they were everywhere? Who would take responsibility for that? I mean, there is some kind of emergency response system somewhere. But I did not expect it to be here, and we would be.
Well, we fought for it very diligently last year with Matthew to get the state to do any cleanup in the lagoon, debris, people's docks, foam, giant pieces of foam, people's rooftops, and we had more success this year. But no, there is not a good response plan out there, and in fact we were having trouble getting the state to even acknowledge that maybe some of those fish should be picked up until we got the governor to send some of his secretaries down here to see the scale of what we were experiencing.
They literally told us to let them sink. That's what they said. So that's the problem. So if that's the response we're going to get if we don't do anything, then we just lost a huge opportunity to pull everything we need to get out, out of the lagoon, in my opinion. And so nobody wants to spend money on this. I don't think, maybe a better idea would be to bring back what it would cost, so people could see the negligibility of it.
We'll do some.
So we would be happy to be supportive if you need somebody to go with you to the manager.
Todd.
And after that, just look at us as the stopgap for the near future while we in parallel push for a more permanent solution, so that if it happens tomorrow, that we don't let what none of us want to happen, but at the same time we parallel what is a more permanent response action.
We can advocate for solutions without spending a dollar. I know 2 years ago, dumpsters were placed at all the causeways, but it was too late in the game. By that time fish were sinking; they were irrecoverable. But I loved that idea of dumpsters because there were people out there grabbing dead fish and throwing them in dumpsters. We can advocate for stuff like that without spending a penny. So, as a body, we could go to the county manager and say, your emergency response team should look at this. We have suggestions that we support that would be good for the recovery, good for the lagoon, and then put the ball in their court to see how they respond.
I would expect all of that to, I've got my staff primed for that, right? You call solid waste about dumpsters, you call Parks and Rec about picking up the public shorelines, and all of those things would still, right? And you coordinate with all the do-good nonprofit groups that get volunteers out there. It's the big open water that is the question that nobody dealt with
Nobody dealt with
previously.
them, and they all sank.
Okay.
So if you have an opportunity, because we didn't, that's what Virginia's talking about, the way and correct me if I'm wrong, she's not talking about us paying for dumpsters and, trash bags and stuff like that. She's talking about having somebody out in the open water pulling the fish in so they don't sink, because no volunteers are going to get to that. So that's what we're talking about.
Okay, I'm going to need a motion to continue 5 minutes. Make a motion to continue for 5 minutes. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay. Are there any more public comments?
Hello, I'm Gail Meredith from the Brevard Indian River Lagoon Coalition also. And I've been to almost all your meetings, and I've listened very intently. And the one thing that from the presentations and the lists and all the talk, the one thing I haven't heard you repeating is the business about what Dr. Treffery said about the muck and the clay and the sod, and how we should be discouraging the planting of sod. I haven't heard that come up anymore, but that was very clear to me at the time, that we should strongly discourage the planting of sod, which I keep seeing in my neighborhood. Just lay it down. So that's something I wanted to mention, even though it sounds kind of odd at this point after the discussion we've had. So.
I mean, there has been talk of lagoon-friendly landscapes, but specifically talking about a campaign against sod has not been a part of our conversations to date.
Well, you remember what he said about the muck and the portion of the muck that is clay. Do you remember, John, how much?
Yeah, and he says it's mostly from sod. He was advocating, though, not of totally eliminating sod, but plant the landscape, the lagoon-friendly landscaping with the buffers down to the lagoon and careful with the edging and all those sorts of practices that we've been telling the public about for quite some time now. I don't think we'd have to be very successful if we led a campaign against sod.
Well, eventually, in 10 years, I bet we will have a tax on sod. I mean, I hope that we do. I hope that we get serious about calling out things like that, because there's a limited number of people that produce sod, and we know who they are. And how do we start becoming serious about what we're doing as opposed to making it a nice, fluffy thing that we're encouraging? Anyway, I don't remember the numbers, but you probably do, of how much the clay contributes to, the sod contributes to the muck.
He's never given numbers about the percentages that sod contribute to muck. He talks about what the content of the muck is, and it may have 60% silt and clay in there. And he says a lot of that silt and clay looks like the silt and clay that's in the sod.
Privately, he's pretty clear about it. About the 60%.
I don't discuss private conversations.
For some reason, this is very controversial. Anyway, that's my 2 cents that I think we should, in our list, be, in our education program, be very clear about that sod is of all the things, the sod is the worst.
Yes. Thank you, Gail. Any other comments? Any comments from our committee?
These that were handed out, the interoffice memo and the 2 letters from Cape Canaveral, what were those? Were those just for?
Those were the additional withdrawals.
Oh.
They were in that table, and we just, the letters didn't get included in your packet.
Okay, and then the interoffice memo, that was what we sent to the cities about the sewage?
No, this was the analysis that was done back in November. That's how we came to the $840,000 set aside for the lateral, for the public-private lateral.
Thank you.
John?
Very quickly. We've been engaged in this for now 14 months, I think it is. We've become a self-managed work group. I think we should acknowledge that we'd be nowhere without Virginia, without her department, without the team she's put together. This has been the largest single contribution beyond a whole bunch of money to fixing the lagoon, and I offer my congratulations.
Thank you. Pardon me?
You're going to talk about the chair?
Oh, yes, okay.
So one of the contributors has been our chair, and the chair and vice chair is an annual deal that in March you're up for.
That's
rethinking.
right. That's right. So you get to share the fun.
So many thanks to our current chair and vice chair.
But now the nomination we will make probably up at the top of the meeting, or?
However you want to handle that.
Okay, so, well, let's come prepared with those nominations and then turn it over to the new chair. Can we do that at the March meeting? Okay, great. It's certainly been my honor to serve as chair, and I'm looking forward to someone else being in this position. And just, kind of hang back.
I'm not volunteering. The emergency response comment, if we have a fish kill, I think you could probably take a compressor into your backyard, take a hose, punch some holes in it, lay it down as an emergency measure until something else happens. I think everybody, just like the people fighting fires with their garden hoses, the house fires, until the fire department can get there, I think there are things you can do to start to aerate the water. We're not trying to bring it back fully with approaches like this, but I'm convinced that if we had a whole army of people who took all the compressors that they have for washing their houses and took them out to their backyards during a fish kill event, they could probably stem it a little bit and lessen the impact of that fish kill in that particular location for a little bit. Not for weeks, but it could help stem the tide. So I think people need to think about what they could do at their houses besides protecting the lagoon with landscaping, but think about how they could aerate the water. Anthony, you were talking about to us earlier this week about a friend of yours who's an oyster farmer who uses little aeration systems to keep his oysters alive during times of low dissolved oxygen. People have aquariums all throughout the county, and there's aquarium shops all throughout the county. I think things like that could be done. I just want to stop there.
Okay, great.
Look, John brings up an important part of emergency planning, and that's communication.
Yeah.
Emergency planning isn't just going out and acting, it's communicating. So I think along with that emergency plan, if one was to develop, we should come up with, here are some simple solutions that may stem the tide. And then also, when do they go? When do I go and do it?
How about an alert?
Now? John, would you recommend now?
No.
Okay.
When you see the fish coming to the surface, gasping for air,
That's a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Well, let's hope we don't see any of that. We're adjourned.
The opinions expressed by any member of the public during any period of public comment do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, or the program sponsor, and are solely those of the presenter. The Board of County Commissioners of Brevard County, Florida, Space Coast Government Television, and the program sponsor hereby expressly disclaim any and all responsibility or liability for any defamatory or slanderous statements expressed by any member of the public during any such period.